Two old men were burying their family's last hope. A young lord. Depleted mines. Rutted roads. Winter in 2 months and an empty treasury. They expected him to break down and run away. But he sat down at the table, asked for a map of the province, and began writing a list. The kind written by people who've taken over a loss-making branch on the brink of bankruptcy. A cold stone under his cheek. The smell of wax and dampness. Water dripping somewhere. Aiden flings his eyes open and stares at a black boot with a scuffed buckle. Towering over the boot stands an old man in a gray cloak, the face of a man who came to bury hope. A second man stands beside him, just as gray, just as dead inside. A stained glass window hangs above them, a raven on a black field. The Holdgrave family crest. Aiden knows this, and yet he doesn't. Because 3 seconds ago, his name was Daniel Ho, 34 years old. A highway at night. His daughter's birthday. He fell asleep at the wheel. And then nothing. And now a stone under his cheek. A stranger's morning doublet, 2 sizes too big. The body of a 19-year-old boy that aches as if it had been wrung out like a rag. Aiden sits down. His head is throbbing with pain. The memories of the young Aiden Holdgrave flood his mind like a stranger's folder opening on his desktop. His father died 3 weeks ago. His older brother Lorcan took the south, the fertile lands, the warm ports, the trade routes, and the youngest was bequeathed Holdgrave, the northwestern corner of the duchy. Depleted silver mines, rutted roads, empty villages where the old bury the old, 442 marks in the treasury, 200 armed neighbors beyond the pass who are already dividing his land on maps. And 2 months until winter. The first old man coughs. Seneschal Garvin, 62 years old. He served even the grandfather. He cautiously suggests that the young lord should rest. Business can wait until morning. The second one nods. Captain of the guard Ulrich, a scar running across his entire cheek. He fixes Aiden with the kind of gaze one gives a calf facing its first winter. With pity, Aiden stands up. His knees are shaking. His hands are thin and white. The hands of a boy who has never worked a day in his life. He looks at his palms, then at the stained glass window, then at the 2 old men who are already mentally counting how many weeks this boy will last before the neighbor arrives to take everything away. And Aiden smiles. Not desperately, not maliciously. It's the smile of a man who's been handed a project where everything is already broken, which means everything can be rebuilt from scratch. Garvin blinks. For 3 weeks, he'd seen nothing but emptiness on the gentleman's face. And now, a smile. Strange. Aiden demands a map of the province, a list of all the villages, a list of all the artisans, even those who gave up their trade long ago, and something hot to drink. An hour later, he's sitting in his father's study. It's cold. The fireplace hasn't been lit in 3 weeks. On the table lies a yellowed, worn map stained with wax. Aiden looks at it and sees what no one else in this world is capable of seeing. He sees a system. Here's the main road. It runs south from the castle through the pass to the trade routes. It's in disrepair. It was repaired 8 years ago. Every merchant loses 2 days traveling on it. 200 lost days a year mean hundreds of marks flowing into the pockets of neighboring barons. Here are 3 villages to the north. They once had 300 people each. Now there are 40 in each. The young people have gone south. The old folks are living out their days. The fields are empty, but there's soil, and there's water, and there are hands. There's just no one to tell those hands what to do. Here are the mines. 4 of them, all closed. The silver ran out 15 years ago, and everyone decided the mines were dead. But Aiden knows something no one else in this world knows. The silver ran out, but the lead, copper, and coal haven't gone anywhere. It's just that no one here considers them resources. Lead is roof tiles. Copper is boilers and coins. Coal is heat. It's all lying in the ground, waiting. He grabs a quill, dips it in ink, writes. A list. A long one. A detailed one. The kind you draw up when taking over a loss-making branch. Assets. Staff. Cash flow. Critical failure points. Deadlines. The pen is shoddy. The ink is thick. His fingers, unaccustomed to writing, start to ache after 20 minutes. But when Garvin peeks in with a bowl of hot soup, He sees 4 sheets covered in small handwriting with numbers and diagrams he doesn't understand. Aiden looks up. He asks, how many people live in town? About 300. How many artisans? 28 if you count the old men and apprentices. Is there a blacksmith? Old Bran. He works alone. There are almost no orders. A carpenter? Yes. A potter? Yes. A seamstress? Yes. A leather worker? Yes, but he's been out of business for a long time. A cooper? Yes, but he drinks. Aiden writes down every name, every trade. Garvin freezes. In 30 years of service to 3 generations of Holdgreaves, he has never seen the Lord write down the name of a cooper. Aiden leans back in his chair. The chair creaks, and he announces that in 3 days he will gather all the artisans in the main square. Everyone, without exception. Why? Aiden says he'll give them work. Garvin cautiously reminds him of the 442 marks, which will barely last until winter. Aiden fixes him with a piercing gaze. That's exactly why we can't wait. If you sit idly by, in 2 months you'll have 0 marks and a dead city. Spend 100 now, and in 3 months the treasury will have more than it does today. Garvin doesn't understand, but he nods. In 30 years, he's learned one thing. When the Lord speaks with eyes like that, it's useless to argue. The next morning, Aiden leaves the castle and walks into town, alone, without a guard. Ulrich catches up to him at the gates. My lord shouldn't walk unescorted. Aiden retorts that he must see the town with his own eyes. Ulrich walks beside him, in silence. The city is dead. Not literally. People wander the streets. Smoke creeps from the chimneys. But everything is gray and quiet and slow, like a person who is still breathing but has already stopped living. The shops are closed. Half the houses have boarded up windows. The market square, which could hold 500 people, is empty. 3 old women are selling turnips. Aiden walks and counts. Houses, people, windows, wells. The width of the streets. He stops at the blacksmith shop. A sagging roof. Soot. A hammer strikes from behind the door, sparsely and listlessly, like the heart of a weary beast. Aiden enters. Inside is Bran. Huge hands, a graying beard, eyes red from the smoke. He's forging a horseshoe. Slowly, without interest. He looks up, sees the Lord, stabs the hammer into the anvil, bows briefly, out of courtesy. Aiden takes the horseshoe, turns it over, puts it back. How many horseshoes a day? 3, sometimes 4. Why not 10? Bran looks at him as if he's crazy. We don't need 10. There's no one to sell them to. Aiden nods. In 3 days, in the square, he'll explain why 10 are needed, and not just horseshoes. Bran snorts. He's silent. The Lord leaves, and the blacksmith stares after him for a long time. He shakes his head. He returns to the horseshoe. For 2 days, Aiden roams the town. He approaches every craftsman, every village elder, every widow whose husband went south and never returned. He memorizes names, faces, who can do what and who needs what. Old Martha makes the best cheese in the province, but can't get it to market. The road is in ruins. Her wagon breaks down at every pothole. Devin the carpenter carves excellent barrels but has no orders. Her brother's vineyards are in the south, but no one will haul the barrels over the mountain pass. Alice, the widow, weaves, but her loom broke 2 years ago and she has no money for repairs. Every story is the same. They have the skills. They have the skills, but there's no system. No one connects one person to another. No one thinks about how goods move from the craftsman to the buyer. Everyone sits in their own hole, waiting for it to become a grave. In the evening, Aiden returns to his office. There are now markings on the map, red dots, blue lines, green circles. Each dot represents a person, every line is a road, every circle is an opportunity. He sees the whole picture. And the picture says one thing: Holdgrave isn't a dead city. Holdgrave is a machine that's been turned off. The parts are all there, the gears are in place. It's just that no one has turned the key. On the 3rd day, Aiden steps out into the square. It's a cold morning. The wind from the mountains smells of snow. Before him stand 28 craftsmen. They look gloomy. Their hands are in their pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. They know why they've been summoned. The new lord wants to raise taxes, or impose a labor levy, or some other folly that will only make things worse. Aiden climbs the steps of City Hall. 28 pairs of eyes look back at him. Without hope, without anger, they're just waiting. He places his purse on the railing, unties it, pours 100 silver marks onto the stone. The coins jingle in the silence. 28 pairs of eyes widen. Aiden says he's paying in advance, for a month, For work they don't have yet. Silence, then a whisper, then a murmur. Bran steps forward. What kind of work is this? Aiden pulls a list from his bosom. He reads it. To Bran the blacksmith. 200 nails of the same length, exactly the same. Every nail is different from the next. Bran frowns. Why on earth would a gentleman need nails of the same length? It's a whim, Aiden replies calmly. In 3 weeks, Bran will have so much work that he'll hire 3 apprentices. And in a year, he'll be the first man in the north whose nails are bought everywhere, because they're all the same. Bran opens his mouth, closes it. He can't find the words. Aiden reads on. To Devon the carpenter, 40 identical boxes with hinged lids. To Race the potter, 300 jugs of the same volume. To Nell the seamstress, 100 identical sacks. To Thorn the tanner, 50 straps for securing cargo. Every order is like this. Identical items, standard sizes, exact numbers. None of the 28 has ever received an order like this. No one understands why. But 100 marks glisten on the stone in the morning light. And everyone is thinking of the same thing. About the empty pot. About the wife who's been cooking soup from a single turnip for a month. About the children who go to bed hungry. Bran steps forward first. He takes his share. He nods. I'll do it. Devon follows him. Then Race. Then the rest. One by one. In silence. Only the coins jingle. The square empties, and Garvin approaches Aiden. The old seneschal's face is pale. The young lord has just spent a quarter of the treasury on nails and sacks. Aiden shakes his head. No. He spent a quarter of the treasury on 28 families who, tonight for the first time in half a year, will have a proper dinner. And the nails and sacks are a bonus. Garvin doesn't understand, but he remains silent. He finds himself falling silent more and more often around this young man, because the young man says things that sound like madness. Yet he looks at him with the eyes of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. On the 4th day, Aiden hadn't slept. He was sitting in his father's study counting. 3 sheets of paper lay before him. The first was a road map. On the second was a list of villages with their populations. On the third were columns of numbers he'd been jotting down all night by candlelight. The candle had burned out. He lit a second one. The numbers didn't add up well. 340 marks. 2 months until winter. 300 people in the town. Another 400 or so in the surrounding villages. 700 mouths to feed. The grain reserves in the town's granaries would last 6 weeks with strict rationing. After that, famine would set in. And after the famine, people would start fleeing. Those who could would head south. Those who couldn't would die. And by spring, Holdgrave would be an empty name on a map that the neighboring barons would redraw over dinner. Aiden rubbed his eyes. His eyes were young, sharp. They saw clearly even by candlelight. His body was young and supple, and didn't ache after an 18-hour workday like his old body in Chicago. That was his only advantage. He stood up. He walked over to the window. Outside, the dawn was gray. The mountains to the north were already white. Snow had settled on the peaks 2 weeks earlier than usual. Winter would come early. So not 2 months, a month and a half. Aiden returned to the table. He took a blank sheet of paper and began to write a plan. Not a to-do list, a plan. The kind he'd written when he took over a new, unprofitable warehouse in Illinois. With dates, with people in charge, with resources, with checkpoints. First item, food. We won't have enough grain, so we need to buy some. From whom? He unfolded the map. The nearest grain market is to the south, across the mountain pass. A 4-day journey. Prices are at summer levels now. In a month, they'll be at fall levels. In 2 months, winter levels. A 3-fold difference. If we buy now at the summer price and bring it back before the first snow, we can stock up for the whole winter. That will cost 180 marks. More than half of the remaining treasury. Garvin will say this is madness. But Garvin doesn't know what a forward contract is. Aiden does. And he knows something else too. You don't have to buy grain with silver. You can buy grain with a promise. With a piece of paper stating that Holdgrave will pay in 6 months, with interest. They don't do that here. Here, you pay with coins, or not at all. But Aiden remembered how, in the 14th century in his world, Italian bankers began using promissory notes. They haven't gotten that far here yet, so he'll be the first. Second point, The road. The main road through the pass is the lifeline. Without it, the city is dead. It's impossible to repair the entire road. There aren't enough people or time. But the critical sections can be repaired. 3 bridges, 2 landslide-prone areas, 1 crossing over a stream. If we can do this in a month, travel time will be cut from 4 days to 2.5. That will change everything. We'll need people for this. 20 people for a month. We'll have to feed them. We'll need tools. There's wood and stone on site. Third point. The mine. An old silver mine northeast of the city. It was closed 15 years ago. Aiden studied the records in his father's archive. The silver had indeed run out. But in the old mining foreman's report, there was a line that no one had noticed. The foreman wrote that dark-colored rock with a metallic sheen had been discovered on the lower levels. Unsuitable. Work was halted. Aiden read that description 3 times. Dark rock with a metallic sheen. Lead. Or copper. Or both. In this world, lead was worth little. But only because there was so little of it. Lead sheets for roofs. Lead pipes for water mains. Lead weights for fishing nets. Copper was more valuable. Copper boilers. Copper wire. Copper coins. If the mine yielded even just copper, Holdgrave would survive. Item 4. An inn. It was an idea that had occurred to Aiden as he studied the roadmap one night. There wasn't a single inn on the pass between Holdgrave and the southern lands. Merchants spent the night in the open, or in their wagons, or they didn't travel at all. What if they built an inn? Not a tavern, not a barn with straw. A real inn. Clean rooms. Warm meals. Fixed prices. A safe place for horses and goods. Nothing like this existed on the Airden passes. Every merchant who heard about such a place would make a detour here. And every merchant meant silver. And news. And connections. In the morning, Aiden called for Garvin, Ulrich, and Father Simon. Father Simon was a merchant, 65 years old, thin, gaunt, with a perpetually dissatisfied expression. He regarded every coin as a personal loss. They sat down at the table in the study. Aiden laid out his plan before them. 4 pages of fine handwriting. Father Simon read the first page. He turned pale. He read the second. He flushed. By the third, his hand began to tremble. He looked up and said that the young gentleman was proposing to spend nearly the entire treasury in a single month. Aiden nodded. Father Simon said that this was suicide. Aiden replied that suicide was sitting on 340 marks and waiting for winter. Money isn't food. Money in the treasury doesn't keep you warm or feed you. Money only works when it's in motion. Father Simon opened his mouth to object. Garvin placed a hand on his shoulder, silently. Ulrich sat in the corner and listened. He didn't understand the numbers, but he understood people. And he could see that this kid wasn't rambling. This kid knows something they didn't. Aiden continued. He explained about the grain. He explained that if they sent a messenger now and signed a contract to buy grain at the summer price, with half paid now and half in the spring, they could buy enough grain to last the whole winter. Father Simon asked who in their right mind would sell grain on the promise of payment in the spring. Aiden pulled out another sheet of paper. There was text written on it. Simple. Clear. A document in which Aiden, on behalf of the Holdgrave clan, pledged to pay the specified amount by the specified date. Secured by a share of the mine's output, and bearing the clan's seal. A promissory note. The first in Airden's history. Father Simon read the text 2 times, then a 3rd time. Then he looked at Aiden the way one looks at a man who has just spoken in a language that doesn't exist, and he quietly asked where the young gentleman had gotten it from. Aiden replied that he had read it in one of the books in his father's archive. It was a lie, but he couldn't tell the truth. Ulrich spoke for the first time. He asked about the road. He said that repairing the road in the fall meant sending people out into the mud and cold. Aiden replied that that was exactly why they needed to start today. Every day of delay was a day closer to the first snow, after which repairs would be impossible. Ulrich was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. He was a soldier. He understood the urgency. Aiden gave each of them a task. Garwin was to find 20 men in town who would agree to work on the road for pay and food. Ulrich was to inspect the old mine and make a list of what was needed for clearing it. Father Simon was to prepare 2 copies of a promissory note. They went their separate ways. Garwin was last. He stopped at the door. he turned around and said that the old duke had never conducted business this way. Aidan looked at him and replied that the old duke was dead and that he had no intention of repeating his mistakes. But he intended to finish what his father hadn't had time to do. Garvin shuddered. There was something in the boy's eyes that shouldn't have been there. Something old. Something was heavy. As if behind those young eyes sat someone who had lived far longer than 19 years. Garvin shook his head. He bowed and left. That same day, Aidan sent a messenger south. A young man named Theo, 17 years old, fast, reliable. The only one in town with a horse capable of crossing the pass in 2 days. Theo carried a letter and a promissory note. The letter was addressed to the Merchants' Guild of the city of Reinhold, the largest grain market in the southern part of the duchy. In the letter, Aidan offered to purchase 200 measures of grain at the current summer price, with half to be paid in silver upon delivery and half by promissory note, due on the first day of spring. The price was fair, even generous one. But the payment terms were unheard of. No one had ever paid with paper. Aidan knew the guild might refuse. But he also knew about merchants. Merchants aren't afraid of risk. Merchants are afraid of lost profit. And a promissory note bearing the seal of an ancient house and secured by mine output isn't just a piece of paper. It's a bet. And someone in the guild would surely want to make that bet. While Theo rode south, Aidan set about making preparations. He gathered 23 men. Not the best. There weren't any better ones. Just people. Old men, young guys, and 2 teenagers with nothing better to do. He led them to the first bridge. The bridge over the Sarabrianca Creek, 3 hours' walk from the city. Wooden. Rotten. It would collapse under a loaded cart. Aidan didn't know how to build bridges. He'd never held an axe in his life. But he knew how to organize work. He divided the men into 3 groups. The first group was felling trees. The second group hewn the logs. The third dismantled the old bridge and prepared the supports. Each group knew only its own task. No one got in the other's way. No one waited around. An assembly line. The simplest of principles, one they didn't know here. Old Torvin, who had been cutting wood his whole life, approached Aidan that evening. He said he'd never seen work divided up like that before. Usually, everyone does everything. They jostle, they get in each other's way, they argue. But here, everyone is in their place, and the logs move from the first group to the second, and from the second to the third like water down a gutter. Aidan replied that this was called the division of labor. Torvin repeated those words slowly, as if savoring them. The bridge was built in 5 days. It used to take 3 weeks. When the first wagon crossed the new bridge without a creak and without fear, Torvin took off his hat and scratched the back of his head. He said that if the young gentleman kept acting so strangely, he might as well stay in Holdgrave. And yet he'd been planning to head south before winter. Aidan heard this, and he remembered it. Because it was more important than the bridge, more important than the road, more important than all the silver marks in the treasury. The man who had been planning to leave had decided to stay. That meant the mechanism had begun to work. Theo returned on the 7th day. His horse was covered in soap. Theo himself could barely stay in the saddle, but in his bag lay a rolled-up parchment with 3 seals. Reinhold's Grain Guild had accepted the promissory note. Not the entire guild, just one merchant. His name was Marcus Dern, 40 years old, fat, cunning, with a reputation for backing those whom everyone else had turned their backs on. Marcus Dern read the promissory note. He looked at the Holdgrave seal. He did the math in his head, and he decided to take a chance. 200 measures of grain would be delivered to Holdgrave in 3 weeks, half to be paid in silver upon receipt, the other half by promissory note by spring, plus 10% on top for the risk. Aidan read the terms and smiled. 10% on top. Marcus Dern thought he'd tricked a foolish boy, but in reality, he had just become Holdgrave's first business partner. And in a year, he'd be talking about it with such pride as if he'd come up with the whole thing himself. 90 marks went back to Theo in the south, an advance for the grain. 250 marks remained in the treasury. Father Simon didn't sleep that night. Aidan knew this because he saw the light in the window of his cell until dawn. The old man counted and recounted, and each time, it seemed the young master was leading the family to ruin. But the grain had been purchased, and that was more than half barons in the north could say. Meanwhile, Ulrich returned from the mine. The news was mixed. The entrance tunnels were blocked. The supports had rotted away. Water was knee-deep on the lower levels. But Ulrich had brought back a piece of dark rock, heavy, with a metallic sheen. Aiden took the stone, turned it over in his hands, scratched it with his fingernail. A gray mark remained on the surface. Lead. Definitely lead. He asked Ulrich if he'd seen anything else besides this rock. Ulrich paused. Then he pulled a second stone out of his pocket. Smaller, greenish, with red veins. Copper ore. Aiden closed his eyes for a second. Copper. There was copper in the Holdgrave mines. And it had lain there for all 15 years because these people were looking for silver. Only silver. Because silver meant coins, prestige, and the status of a family. But copper was just copper. To them. To Aiden, copper was the future. Copper nails don't rust. Copper cauldrons last for decades. Every craftsman needs copper wire. Every market needs copper coins. Lead and copper together are two streams of income that aren't dependent on the season and won't run out in 5 years. He ordered Ulrich to take 10 men and begin clearing the entrance to the slowly. Carefully. New fastenings, drainage ditches. No rush. People's safety is more important than speed. Ulrich nodded. He was starting to get used to orders that sounded strange but made sense. People's safety is more important than speed. No lord he knew would ever say such a thing about miners. While some worked in the mine and others on the road, Aiden set about a third task. An inn. He'd found a spot. Half a day's journey from the city, at the mountain pass, stood an old watchtower. Abandoned. The roof had caved in. The walls were intact. A stream nearby. A forest nearby. A road nearby. The perfect spot. He sent the carpenter Devon there with 5 assistants. The task was simple. A roof. 4 walls. 10 rooms. A kitchen. A stable. A fence around the yard. All made of wood and stone found on site. Devon asked how long it would take. Aiden replied, 3 weeks. Devon looked at him as if he were crazy. He said that in 3 weeks you could build a barn, not an inn. Aiden replied that he needed exactly that, a barn, but a clean one, with a sturdy roof, with locks on the doors, and a sign. Because to a merchant who'd spent 3 days sleeping in a wagon in the rain, even a clean barn would seem like a palace. Devon thought it over, and he agreed. A week after all 3 projects had begun, Aiden ran into his first serious problem. People. There weren't enough of them. 23 on the road, 10 at the mine, 5 at the inn, 28 craftsmen in town. That's 66 people, out of 300 in town. The rest were old people, children, and women. People no one considered part of the workforce. Aiden sat at the table, staring at his list. He thought. Back in Chicago, when he was short on people, he'd just hire more. Here, there was no one to hire. It was a 4-day journey to the nearest town. No one would go to Holdgrave voluntarily, so he'd have to make do with the people he had. Everyone. He stood up, left his office, walked through town. He went into the first house on the outskirts. Marin, a widow, lived there with her 3 children. Her eldest daughter was 14. Eden asked Marin if she knew how to sew. Marin said she did. He asked if she knew how to cook for 20 people. Marin paused and replied that she used to be able to. Back when her husband was alive and they ran a tavern in the village. The tavern closed when her husband went off to fight in Baron Morven's war and never returned. Aiden offered her a job, to cook for the road workers. Every day, hot meals. Porridge in the morning. In the evening, meat stew. Payment in silver. Every week. Marin looked at him, unable to believe it. Then she asked where the meat would come from. Aiden replied that there would be meat. From the village of Stonehill, an hour's walk to the north. 2 families live there who raise goats. He'd already made arrangements. Marin got to work that very day. Aiden went on. House after house. Widow after widow. Old man after old man. He found a job for everyone. Old Pear, who couldn't lift an axe, knew how to weave baskets. Baskets were needed at the mine to haul out the ore. 13-year-old Lynn could count better than the adults. Aiden sat her down next to him in his office and gave her the task of calculating the consumption of candles and firewood for each of the 3 projects. She calculated silently and quickly, making no mistakes. 2 days later, Aiden found work for another 40 people. None of them had previously been considered useful. Old people, women, teenagers, the disabled. A former soldier with 1 arm, whom everyone called One-Armed Finn, was put on guard duty at the warehouse. Finn couldn't chop wood, but he could sit by the door and make sure no one stole tools. And he did it with such zeal that within a week, even the rats were afraid to approach him. Garvin watched, silently. Every evening he went into the office and reported. And every evening the list of things he didn't understand grew longer. The young master hired a widow to feed the workers. That is the Lord's duty, not a widow's. The young master put a little girl in charge of keeping track of candle usage. That is the treasurer's job, not a child's. The young master talks to the cripple Finn as an equal. That's improper. But the bridge is built. The workers are fed. The candles are counted more accurately than ever. And Finn in the warehouse is the best caretaker Garvin has seen in 30 years. There were results, and Garvin couldn't argue with that. On the 14th day, something else happened. Aidan was walking through the market square when he saw a girl. She was standing by the well, talking to an old woman. The girl was holding a bundle of herbs. She was explaining to the old woman how to make a cough remedy. Quietly, patiently, repeating herself twice. The girl was tanned, freckled, with rough hands. Her hair was tucked under a headscarf. Her clothes were simple, rustic. Aidan stepped closer. He asked who she was. She looked up. She looked him straight in the eye, without bowing, without fear. She said her name was Lyra Mir, from the village of Torfionaya Balka. She's an herbalist. She came to the city because there were no more people in the village who needed herbs. Aidan asked what kind of herbs. Lyra began to list them. Yarrow for fever, willow bark for pain, mint for stomach aches, plantain for wounds, St. John's wort for melancholy. She spoke calmly and precisely, like someone who knew her craft inside and out. Aidan listened. And the longer he listened, the clearer it became to him that standing before him was someone who, in his world, would be called a pharmacist. No, not a pharmacist. Pharmacists sell ready-made remedies. Lyra knew the raw materials. She knew their properties. She knew the dosages. She knew what went well together and what didn't. She was a researcher. In a world where researchers didn't exist, he asked her why she didn't work at some lord's court. Lyra smiled wryly and replied that lords don't hire country girls whom they consider half-witches. People come to her at night, in secret. By day, they pretend not to know her. Aidan nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he needed someone who understood human health, that he would soon have workers in the mine, on the road, and at the construction site, and that these people would get sick and injure themselves, and they needed someone who could help them, not a priest who just prays. Someone with herbs and knowledge. Lyra looked at him in silence for a long time. Then she asked if he paid. Aidan replied that he did, just like everyone else, in silver, every week, and that she would have a workshop, her own, with a door, and her name would be written on the door. Lyra turned away, quickly, but Aidan saw that she had pressed her lips together, and that her hands were trembling. She said she'd come tomorrow, and she left, quickly, without looking back. The next day she came, with a sack of herbs on her back and eyes that held such determination that even Ulrich took a step back. The third week, the road came back to life. Not all of it, just 3 critical sections. But that was enough. The first caravan crossed the pass in 2.5 days instead of 4, 3 wagons. A small merchant named Gilbert. He was carrying cloth and salt from the south. He was traveling the usual route through Baron Morven's lands, but at the fork in the road, he saw a sign, a new one, made of wood, with clear lettering, via Holdgrave, a 2-day journey, an inn at the pass. Gilbert turned off the main road out of curiosity, and he didn't regret it. The bridge over the Silver Stream held his loaded wagons without a creak. The road wasn't perfect, but it was passable. And at the pass, the inn was waiting for him. Not a palace. Devon had built exactly what Aidan had promised. A simple barn, but with a sturdy roof, locks on the doors, a warm hearth. With hot soup cooked by the cook Aidan had hired. With a stable where the horses stood in dry conditions, and with prices written on a board by the entrance. No haggling. No eyeballing it. A fixed price. 2 copper coins per night. 3 for a night with dinner. 5 for a night with dinner, breakfast, and horse feed. Gilbert was stunned. In 20 years of trading, he'd stayed at dozens of inns. At every one, he'd been overcharged. At every place, they haggled. Every morning, he'd find that the price had gone up, because the night had been cold, or simply because the innkeeper felt like it. But here, the price was posted on the board. And no surprises. He spent the night there. In the morning, he paid his bill. And he rode on to Holdgrave. In town, he sold cloth and salt in the market square. Not to three old women with a turnip. To people. Real people who were buying. Because they had silver. Silver that Aidan paid them for their work. When Gilbert was leaving, he asked the guard at the gate if the inn would be open in the winter. The guard replied that it would be. Gilbert nodded and said he'd be back. And he'd tell others. Aidan stood on the castle wall and watched as Gilbert's 3 wagons disappeared around the bend. Standing nearby stood Garvin. Aidan said that 1 merchant meant 3 wagons. 10 merchants meant 30 wagons. 30 wagons a month meant a market. A market meant taxes. Taxes meant the treasury. The treasury meant the people. The people meant power. Garvin listened. And for the first time in 3 weeks, he didn't reply that that wasn't how things were done. Because he had just seen it was done. 2 days after Gilbert, a second merchant arrived. Then a third. Each one said the same thing. The road is shorter. The bridge is new. There's a place to spend the night at the pass. The prices are fair. The word spread. Slowly. But surely. Like a crack in the ice. In the 4th week, a larger merchant arrived. His name was Roshan, a Chiron merchant dealing in spices and dyes. 4 wagons. 12 guards. He was traveling north and heard about Holdgrave from Gilbert at the tavern beyond the pass. He turned off to take a look. Roshan was in a league of his own. He didn't buy or sell trifles. He was looking for routes, new paths along which to transport valuable goods. And when he rose through Holdgrave and saw the road, the bridge, the path, and the market square, where 5 stalls were already set up, he stopped. He requested an audience with the young lord. Aidan received him in his study. Roshan sat down across from him. He looked at the map on the wall, at the lists, at the numbers, and asked one question. How much does it cost to rent a stall in the market square? Aidan named the price. Roshan didn't haggle. He paid 3 months in advance and said he would send his representative, a permanent one. When Roshan left, Garvin asked if the young gentleman understood what had just happened. A Chiron merchant had rented a spot in the market of a forgotten city on the edge of nowhere. That meant Holdgrave had made it onto the trade map. Aidan nodded and replied that this was precisely why he'd spent a quarter of the treasury on nails of a single length. Garvin didn't understand the connection, but he remembered it. Alongside the trade, the mine was taking shape. Ulrich cleared the entrance tunnel. He reinforced the vaults. He drained the water. On the 10th day of work, the miners reached the vein. Lead. Rich. Dark. Plenty of it. Ulrich sent a messenger to the city with a fist-sized chunk of ore. Aidan went down into the mine himself, for the first time in his life. Dark. Damp. Low ceiling. The smell of wet stone and something metallic. The miners worked by torchlight. 10 men. Thin. Quiet. They watched the young lord who had climbed down into the pit with them and didn't mind getting his hands covered in clay. Aidan examined the vein. He felt the rock. He didn't understand a thing. He wasn't a geologist. But old Court was standing nearby. A former mine foreman. 70 years old. Blind in one eye. No one had called for him because the mine was closed. Aidan found him in the 3rd village. He was sitting on a bench outside his house, waiting to die. Aidan brought him back. Court felt the vein. He sniffed the rock. He licked it. And he said there was enough lead here for 20 years of work. And if they dug to the left, there'd be copper. He could sense it. Aidan asked how he knew. Court replied that 40 years in the mine teach you to sense the rock as if it were a living thing. Aidan believed him. Because in his world, veteran warehouse workers could also sense where the right box was in 30 seconds, while newbies spent an hour searching with a scanner. Experience is a system too. It's just not written down on paper but in your hands, your nose, and your tongue. He appointed Court as the mine's foreman. Court couldn't believe it. He asked if he'd heard correctly. Aidan repeated himself. Court was the foreman. Full authority over the work underground. Triple the pay of a regular miner. And a private room in town, with a stove. Court was silent for a full minute. Then he nodded. He turned toward the vein and began giving orders. His voice was so loud that the walls shook. An hour later, the miners were working twice as fast. Not because he was shouting, but because he knew what he was doing, and they could see it. Meanwhile, Lyra had set up her workshop. Aiden had given her a room on the first floor of City Hall, with a window, with a stove, with a door on which Devon, at Aiden's orders, had carved the letters, Ms. Lyra, Heelgreaves Healer. Lyra stood in front of that door and looked at the letters. For a long time. In silence. Then she went inside and began arranging the herbs on the shelves. Her first patient arrived an hour later. A miner. He'd cut his hand. She washed the wound. Applied an ointment of yarrow and honey. Bandaged it. The miner left. A day later, a second one came. Then a third. A week later, people every day. Road workers, miners, carpenters from the inn, minor cuts, bruises, colds. Lyra treated them all. Silently, quickly, without prayers or quackery. A decoction, an ointment, bandages, advice on how to prevent a recurrence. Father Simon was displeased. He believed that healing was God's work and that a herbalist had no right to occupy a room in the town hall. He went to Aiden and said so directly. Aiden listened and replied that in 1 week, Lyra had returned 5 workers to duty who, without her, would have been bedridden for 10 days each. 5 workers mean 50 man-days of work. 50 days of work means a bridge, or 50 meters of road, or a metric ton of rock from the mine. Father Simon may be dissatisfied, but the numbers certainly aren't on his side. Father Simon left. Silently, he slammed the door. The first conflict within the council. Not the last. By the end of the 4th week, Aiden sat down at the table and tallied the results. The treasury. 170 marks spent. On grain, the road, the mine, the inn, and wages. 170 marks remained. But income from the market. 5 merchants paid for stalls. 12 marks. The inn brought in 8 marks over 3 weeks. The mine wasn't generating any income yet, but the first batch of lead ore was on the surface, and the blacksmith Bran was already smelting a test ingot. Expenses were falling. Revenue was rising. The numbers were moving in the right direction. Slowly. But they were moving. Aiden leaned back in his chair. He looked out the window. Outside in the square, workers were carrying logs to the new warehouse. Children were running past the well. Old Martha was walking toward the market square with a basket of cheese, along the road that had been repaired 3 days ago. He closed his eyes. For a single second, and he saw his daughter. Little one, in a dress with giraffes. She was waiting for him on her birthday. He never made it there. His eyes stung. He opened them. He stood up and went to check on the construction site, because standing still means thinking, and thinking means remembering, and he can't remember, because if he starts remembering, he'll stop, and if he stops, people will die. Not in Chicago. Here. The grain arrived on the 32nd day. 12 wagons. 200 measures. Marcus Dern arrived in person. He sat on the first wagon in a fur coat, with the expression of a man who'd come to attend his own funeral but ended up at a wedding. He'd expected to see a dying city. Instead, he saw the market square with a dozen stalls. A new warehouse by the eastern gate. People walking quickly and purposefully. Not like ghosts. Like the living. Marcus Dern climbed down from the wagon. He looked around. He twitched his mustache. And the first thing he asked was whether young Lord Holdgrave would like to discuss another contract. Aiden invited him into his office. They sat across from each other. Marcus sipped hot cider and looked at the map on the wall. That very map with red dots, blue lines, and green circles. He didn't understand what those markings meant, but he understood something else. This young man had accomplished in a month what most lords fail to do in 10 years. And if he invested in him now, while everyone else was still laughing, he could reap the rewards in a year. Marcus proposed supplying Holdgrave with more than just grain. Cloth, salt, oil, spices, and iron. Everything a growing city needs, on the same terms. Half in silver, half in promissory notes. Aiden listened. He nodded. He did the math in his head, and at just the right moment, he made a move Marcus hadn't expected. He offered Marcus not just a trading partnership, but the chance to become Holdgrave's exclusive supplier. The only one. For 2 years. In return, Marcus would receive a fixed discount of 15% on all goods, and the right of first refusal on the mine's products, lead and copper, at a price 10% below market value. Marcus froze with a mug of cider to his lips. He'd been a merchant for 30 years. He knew how deals worked. And he knew he'd just been offered a monopoly for 2 years, in exchange for a discount. It was like handing over the key to the storeroom in exchange for a promise not to steal too much. Marcus set down his mug. He wiped his mustache and said he agreed. They shook hands. Father Simon drew up the contract, 2 copies, both sealed with wax. For the first time in Airden's history, an exclusive supply contract with fixed terms for the next 2 years had been signed. Marcus left the next day, with empty wagons and a head full of plans. He didn't yet know that Aiden had just tied him to Holdgrave more securely than a rope could. Because now, it was in Marcus's best interest for Holdgrave to grow. Every new family in town meant a new customer for his goods. Every new butcher meant a new order. Marcus had gone from being a merchant to an investor, without even realizing it. The grain was unloaded into the new warehouse. Ulrich posted 2 guards at the door. Aiden counted the sacks himself. 200 measures. That would be enough for the winter, if they were frugal. If they didn't conserve it, it would last 3/4 of the winter. But they needed to conserve it, because the winter would be long. Snow already lay thick on the mountains. The nights had grown cold. The leaves were turning yellow. There were 3 weeks left until the first frost. Aiden called a council meeting. Garvin, Ulrich, Father Simon. And for the first time, Lyra. Father Simon looked at the herbalist as if he'd been served sour milk instead of wine, but he said nothing. Because Aiden was seated at the head of the table, and no one dared to argue with him in front of the others, Aiden outlined the situation. There's grain. The road is open. The mine is producing ore. The inn is bringing in revenue. But winter isn't just cold. Winter is when everything comes to a standstill. The road will close. The pass will be buried in snow. Merchants will stop coming. The mine will slow down. And 700 people in the town and villages will be trapped for 3 months with whatever they have. So we need to prepare. He laid out a plan. First, firewood. We need to stock up on firewood for the entire winter, for every house. He did the math. 3,000 bundles. That's a lot. But the forest is nearby. There are people. 2 weeks of work. Second, insulation. Half the houses in town have cracks in the walls through which heat escapes. Every house needs to be caulked. With moss. With clay. With rags. Anything will do. But every single one. Third, food. There's grain. But grain alone isn't enough. We need fish. The Cerebrianca stream doesn't freeze over all winter. Ulrich confirmed it. So we need to organize a fishing operation. 5 people, every day. Salt and dry the catch. In the warehouse. Fourth, health. Aiden turned to Lyra. He asked what kills people in winter besides hunger. Lyra answered without hesitation. Coughs, fevers, frostbite, food poisoning from spoiled food. Children and the elderly die first. Aiden nodded. He asked if she could prepare a supply of medicines, ointments for frostbite, decoctions for coughs, and tinctures for fever, enough to last the whole winter for 700 people. Lyra paused. Then she said she could. If she were given 2 assistants and access to the forest for gathering, and if Bran would forge her 3 cauldrons of the right size for brewing. Aiden turned to Garvin. He asked if Bran could do it. Garvin said that Bran was already swamped with orders. 200 nails of the same length were just the beginning. Now the blacksmith was making fasteners for the mine, hinges for warehouse doors, and tools for the road workers. He worked from dawn till dusk and had already hired 2 apprentices, just as Aiden had promised in the square on the first day. Aiden smiled. He said that Bran would find time for 3 cauldrons, because Bran now understands what it means to be needed. Garvin nodded. He didn't argue. The council meeting ended. Everyone dispersed. Lyra was the last to leave. She stopped at the door, turned to Aiden, and asked why he was seating her at the same table as the seneschal, the captain of the guard, and the priest. She was a country girl, an herbalist, a half-witch. She wasn't on the same level as these people. Aiden looked at her and replied that in 3 months, when one of these people fell ill with a fever, her hands would be the only thing standing between him and the grave, and that a person who holds the lives of others in their hands can sit at any table they please. Lyra stood there, silently. Then she turned and walked away, quickly, as always, without looking back. But Aiden noticed that she had straightened up. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, Her back was straight. Her head was held high. She didn't walk like a country herbalist who was used to hiding. She walked like Holdgrave's healer. The next 2 weeks were a race. Firewood. 100 people in the forest every day. Aidan organized the work using the same method, division of labor. Some chopped, others sawed. Still others tied the bundles and loaded them. A fourth group hauled them into town. A fifth group stacked it. Bundles of wood piled up next to every house like wooden walls. 3,000 in 2 weeks. Insulation. Aidan personally went around to every house in town, every single one. 112 houses. He peered into cracks. He felt the walls. He checked the roofs. Wherever he found a problem, he sent a 3-person crew. Moss. Clay. Straw. 2 weeks later, not a single house in Holdgrave whistled in the wind. Fish. 5 fishermen on the Silver River every day. The catch was small, but steady. Lyra taught them how to salt the fish properly, not like before. The fish used to go bad after a week. Now it lasted a month. The difference in the recipe lay in the amount of salt and the storage temperature. A small thing, but a small thing that would save lives. Lyra worked every day with her 2 assistants. She dried herbs. She boiled ointments. She prepared tinctures. Her workshop smelled of mint and honey, and something bitter that Aidan didn't know the name of. She worked in silence, intently. Sometimes Aidan would drop by in the evening, not to check up on her, just to talk. She'd tell him about the herbs, about how her mother had taught her to distinguish plants by their scent in the dark, about how she once cured a child of a fever that killed grown men, about how she'd always wanted to write down everything she knew, but she didn't know how to write. Aidan fell silent when she said that. Then he replied that he'd teach her, or find someone who would. Lyra looked at him, with that direct gaze that neither hid nor apologized. And she said he was a strange gentleman. Aidan replied that he'd been told so. The first snow fell on the 48th day, sooner than expected. In the morning, Aidan stepped out onto the castle porch and saw the white city. The roofs had turned white. The square was white. The surrounding mountains stood white and silent. And the town was alive. Smoke rose from every chimney. Every single one. Not like a month ago, when half the chimneys were silent. Now every house had a fire going. Because everyone had firewood. Women stood by the well with buckets. They were talking. Not in silence. Not gloomily. They were talking. The miners were heading to the mine. 8 men. Ulrich led them, tools on their shoulders. There was no joy on their faces, but no despair either. A purpose. They had a purpose. The first stall had opened at the market. Old Martha was selling cheese, the very same cheese she hadn't been able to bring to the market because the road had been damaged. Now the road had been repaired, and Martha stood behind the counter, and she was smiling. Aidan watched this and thought that in Chicago, he had opened 32 warehouses, restructured 14 routes, and saved the company from bankruptcy twice. But not once had he felt what he was feeling now. Because in Chicago, the people he had saved didn't know his name. But here, old Martha waved at him. The cheese was lousy, but her hand was warm. Winter struck on the 53rd day. Not gently, not gradually. It struck like a fist. The temperature plummeted overnight. The wind from the mountains brought a blizzard that didn't let up for 3 days. The pass was closed. The road vanished under the snow.
The inn at the pass stood empty and white as a forgotten tooth.
Holdgrave found itself cut off. 712 people. Aidan knew the exact number because Zion had counted them. Zion Holdgrave, 17 years old, a cousin on his mother's side. She had appeared at the castle during the second week after Aidan's awakening, quiet, petite, with long, dark hair and a habit of counting everything she saw. In a whisper, steps, windows, plates on the table, people in the hallway. She counted as she breathed, without even noticing. After the old duke's death and the division of the lands, she remained with the younger branch of the family, not by choice. Because Lorcan in the south said he didn't need the burden, and Aidan said nothing. He simply accepted it. For the first week, she was invisible. She sat in a corner of the great hall. She ate little. She didn't speak. Eyes downcast, hands on her knees. The habit of someone who'd been told their whole life that they were taking someone else's place. Aidan noticed her on the 3rd day. She was sitting by the fireplace, counting something on her fingers. He walked over. He asked what she was counting. Zion flinched. She looked up, then immediately looked down again, and she said quietly that she was counting how many logs the fireplace in the great hall burned per hour. That came to 4 logs. If the hall was heated 12 hours a day, that was 48 logs. 336 for the week. That's 1,440 in a month. And if there are 7 such fireplaces in the castle, then 10,080 logs are needed each month just for the castle. She said this in a whisper, as if apologizing for doing the math. Aiden sat down beside her and remained silent for a minute. Then he asked if she had ever counted money. Sion nodded. She said she had counted the old Duke's treasury when Father Simon was ill last winter. She counted for 3 days. She didn't make a single mistake with any of the coins. Father Simon checked it and said nothing, which, for him, was the highest praise. Aiden stood up. He went to his study. A minute later, he returned with a thick notebook. He placed it in front of Zion. He said this would be her notebook, an account book. Every day, every expense, every income, every sack of grain, every bundle of firewood, and every coin. She would keep track of it, personally, in her own hand, under her own name. Zion looked at the notebook, at the blank pages, at her name, which Aiden had written on the cover. Zion Holdgrave, Treasurer. She hadn't cried in front of him, but the next morning her eyes were red, and the notebook was open, and the first few lines were already filled in small, neat handwriting. With the numbers aligned in columns so evenly, it was as if they'd been drawn with a ruler. Father Simon learned about the new treasurer at dinner. He choked. He went to see Aiden. He declared that a 17-year-old girl could not be the treasurer. It was an insult to his office and his position. Aiden replied that Father Simon would remain the spiritual mentor and keeper of the seal, but Zion would handle the accounting. Because Zion never makes mistakes with numbers. Never. And Father Simon had made 3 mistakes in the last month, totaling 7 marks. Father Simon turned crimson. He opened his mouth, closed it, left. From that day on, he hadn't spoken to Zion. She didn't notice, or she pretended not to notice. She kept counting. Every day, every night. The notebook filled up, page after page. Aiden checked it every evening. Not a single mistake. Not one. Zion was a perfect machine for numbers, and for the first time in her life, this machine wasn't just working for the sake of it. She was working for someone who appreciated her work. Now, in the middle of winter, Zion sat in the office next to Aiden and laid out the numbers. There was enough grain to last 70 days at the current rate of consumption. The firewood would last 90 days. Salted fish, 40 days. There were 138 marks in the treasury. Income in winter was almost 0. Expenses were stable. If winter lasted the standard 3 months, they would survive. If it lasted longer, it would be difficult. Aiden listened. He nodded. He took notes. And he thought. Winter isn't just about survival. Winter is time. 3 months when you can't build roads or transport goods. But there are other things they can do. Teach. The next morning, he gathered 20 people in the castle's great hall. Artisans, village elders, and miners. He told them that starting today, every evening, this hall would become a school, not for children, for them. Silence. Bran raised his hand. He asked why a blacksmith needed school. Aiden replied that a blacksmith needs to know how to count, not on his fingers but on paper. Because a blacksmith who counts on paper knows how much his work is worth, how much coal it takes to make 100 nails, and how much he loses when he produces defective work, and how much he'll earn if he makes 200 nails a week instead of 100. Bran was silent. He thought. Then he nodded. Aiden taught the first lesson himself. Prime numbers. Addition. Subtraction. Writing them down. 20 grown men sat on benches in the castle's great hall and wrote out numbers on the slate boards that Devon had made in 2 days. It was a strange sight. Bran gripped his stylus as if he wanted to crush it. His fingers, accustomed to a hammer, wouldn't obey him. Cord squinted with one eye and cursed under his breath. Ulrich wrote slowly and carefully, like a first grader. But everyone wrote, because Aidan said it was necessary, and because each of them had already seen that when Aidan says something is necessary, he's usually right. A week later, Aidan added a second subject, reading. Garvin taught it. The old seneschal was the only one in the castle besides Simon's father who could read fluently. Garvin refused at first. He said that teaching men to read was like teaching bears to dance. Aidan replied that bears that dance are worth more than those that don't. Garvin didn't get the joke, but he started teaching, and after 2 weeks, he realized he enjoyed it. That 30 years of service to 3 generations of lords had never given him such a sense of purpose as the look on old Court's face when, for the first time in his life, he read his own name written on the blackboard. Court stood there, staring at the letters. He moved his lips, and the letters formed sounds. And the sounds formed a name. His name. Court. He stood there for a minute. Then he turned to Garvin and said thank you in a voice so moving that Garvin turned away and pretended for a long time that he was looking for chalk. Winter dragged on. Blizzards gave way to silence. Silence gave way to blizzards. The cold was thick and constant, but the town was alive. Smoke rose from every chimney. Every day the miners went down into the mine. 8 men, slowly. Working in the mine is harder in winter. The cold stone makes your fingers stiffen. The torches burn out faster. But the lead was coming in. The copper was coming in. Bran smelted the ore in the forge. He made ingots. He stored them in the warehouse. By spring, when the mountain pass opened, these ingots would turn into money. On the 61st day of winter, a child fell ill. The miller's son, Volt, 3 years old, a fever, a cough, wheezing in his chest. Volt brought him to Lyra at night, in his arms. Lyra Ra looked at the child. She felt his forehead. She listened to his breathing, and she said it was pneumonia. Serious. The child needed warmth, constant warmth. Willow bark decoction every 2 hours, ointment on his chest, and someone to sit by his side and make sure he was breathing, all night long. Volt turned pale. His wife had died a year ago. He was alone with the child. He worked at the mill all day. There was no one to sit with the child at night. Lyra looked at Aidan. Aidan looked at the child. Small, hot, with his eyes closed. His wet hair was plastered to his forehead. He thought of his daughter. He pushed the memory away and told Walt that the child would stay in Lyra's workshop. It's warm here. There's medicine here. Lyra is here. Walt started to say he couldn't afford to pay for the treatment. Aidan cut him off. He said the treatment was free, for everyone, always. Volt stood there. He looked at the young lord. His lips trembled. He didn't cry, but he was close to it. He bowed. He left. Lyra treated the child for 3 days. She didn't sleep. She sat by his side. She changed the compresses. She fed him the herbal decoction drop by drop. On the 3rd night, the fever subsided. The child opened his eyes. He asked for something to eat. Lyra gave him some warm broth. The boy drank it. He fell asleep. Lyra left the workshop at dawn. Aidan was standing by the door. She wasn't surprised. She said the child would live. Aidan nodded. He took off his cloak and draped it over her shoulders. She was wearing only a dress, out in the cold. Her hands were red. Her eyes were sunken. She didn't push the cloak away. She stood there, silently. Then she said quietly that back when she used to treat people in the village, no one ever stood at the door. No one waited. She treated people alone, always. And if a child died, it was her fault, the half-witch. But if the child survived, it was God who saved him, not her. Aidan replied that things would be different here. Lyra nodded. Then she went to sleep, for the first time in 3 days. The news about the child spread throughout the town in a single day. The miller's son had survived. The herbalist had cured him. The Lord had paid. For free. It was strange. It was baffling. It went against everything these people knew about lords. Lords collect taxes. Lords take. Lords don't treat other people's children. But this one did. Something was changing in the town. Slowly. Like ice melting from the inside. People began greeting Aidan on the street. Not with a bow. With a word. Good morning, sir. How did you sleep, sir? Bran made a new batch of nails yesterday, sir. They spoke to him, as if he were a person, not as if he were a lord. Garvin noticed this and frowned. He said that familiarity undermines authority. Aiden replied that authority built on fear crumbles at the first gust of wind. But authority built on the fact that you've healed someone else's child never crumbles. On the 70th day of winter, a woman with a sword knocked on the gates of Holdgrave. Tall, red-haired, wearing tattered leather armor, with a bruise on her cheekbone and a blade at her back that was longer than her arm. The guard at the gate looked up at her. He asked who she was. She introduced herself as Iron Valdrick, the daughter of Knight Valdrick of the barony of Kett. She had come to enlist in the guard. The guard snorted. He called for Ulrich. Ulrich came over. He looked at the woman, at the sword, at the bruise. He asked who had hit her. Iron replied that it was the last commander she'd asked for a place in the ranks. He'd hit her when she didn't leave after his first refusal. She'd hit him back. She'd broken his nose. And she'd left. Because after breaking the commander's nose, there was no point in trying to join his unit anymore. Ulrich looked at her, silently. Then he asked if she knew how to handle that sword, or if she just carried it for show. Iron didn't answer. She drew the blade. She took up a fighting stance, and said she was ready to show him. Ulrich looked around. The courtyard was empty. The wind was whipping snowflakes across the stones. He took his sword from his belt, a training sword with a blunt tip, and tossed the second one to her. She caught it midair. She leaned her long blade against the wall. She picked up the blunt sword. They stood facing each other. Ulrich attacked first. He was a veteran soldier, 58 years old, 3 wars, hundreds of battles. Quick for his age, strong. Iron parried his strike. She stepped to the left. She counterattacked. Ulrich barely managed to block it. She was faster than him, significantly so, and her technique wasn't that of a country girl. Someone had taught her well. They fought for 3 minutes. Ulrich attacked fiercely. He was testing her. Iron kept her distance. She didn't get drawn into a battle of brute strength. She relied on speed and precision. In the 4th minute, she executed a move Ulrich hadn't seen in 20 years. A feint swing to the right, a feint to the left, and a thrust to the torso. The tip of the blunt sword poked Ulrich in the ribs. It didn't hurt, but it was precise. Ulrich stopped. He lowered his sword. He looked at her, then at his ribs, then at her again, and said he would go report to the Lord. Aiden received Iron in his office. She stood before the desk, upright, tense, like someone who's used to the next word being a refusal. Aiden asked where she was from. Iren told him. Briefly, without complaint. The daughter of an impoverished knight. Her father had taught her to wield a sword from the age of 6 because he had no sons. Later, he was ashamed that he'd taught her. Because a girl with a sword isn't a bride, she's a problem. She left home at 18. She traveled through the baronies. She asked to join the guard, mercenary units, caravan escorts. Everywhere it was the same. Laughter, or anger, or hands that reached not for her sword. She fought for 6 years. She almost always won, and not once was she accepted. Aiden listened, silently. Then he said one sentence. He needs her to be stronger than anyone else in this castle. That's her job. Iren froze. She blinked. She asked him to repeat himself. Aiden repeated it. He was taking her on, as a guard. Starting today. Pay like the guards. Barracks, food, weapons. If she proved herself in a month, he'd make her a sergeant. Iren stood there, silent. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes glistened. She wasn't crying. She wasn't the type to cry. But something inside her shifted, like a stone that had held up a dam for many years and suddenly wobbled slightly. She nodded, briefly. She said she wouldn't let him down. She turned. She walked out. Ulrich was waiting outside the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said the barracks were down the hall to the left, the 3rd bunk from the window. Wake up at dawn. She nodded and walked away. Ulrich watched her go. Then he popped into Aiden's office. He said the girl could fight better than any of his 12 guards. Aiden replied that he knew. That's why he was taking her on. Ulrich was silent for a moment. Then he added that the guys in the barracks wouldn't be happy about it. Aiden replied that the guys in the barracks didn't have to be happy. They had to learn. And it's better to learn from someone who's stronger. Ulrich grunted. He left. Iren had settled in within a week, and not gently. The guards eyed her warily. One tried to grab her arm in the barracks at night. She broke 2 of his fingers, cleanly, without a scream. In the morning, he went to Ulrich to complain. Ulrich looked at his fingers, then at Irene. He asked what had happened. Irene replied that she'd been defending her perimeter. Ulrich nodded. He turned to the guard and said that next time, she wouldn't break his fingers, she'd break his arm, and she'd be in the right. No one touched Irene again, and 2 weeks later, she began training the guards. On Aiden's orders, every morning, 2 hours, in the castle courtyard, in the snow, 12 men and 1 woman with a sword. She pushed them to the point of nausea. She didn't yell, she just demonstrated. She showed them a move, slowly, then quickly. Then she'd say, repeat, and if they couldn't do it, repeat again, and again, and again. After a month, Holdgrave's 12 guards moved differently, not like village oafs with pikes, like fighters. Ulrich watched, silently, and one evening he told Aiden that in 30 years of service, he had seen 3 true masters of the sword. Irene was the 4th, and the best of them all. Winter dragged on, the 80th day, the 85th. The grain was running out, the fish were running out, the firewood was running out. Zion counted the days. The numbers were dwindling, but they held out, for now at least. On the 88th day, what Aiden had both expected and feared happened. Wolves. A pack of 20 came down from the mountains, hungry, vicious. They killed 3 goats in the village of Stonehill, the very goats that provided milk for Lyra's workshop. The shepherd barely escaped. He ran into town, without his hat, his eyes wild. Ulrich assembled a squad, 6 guards. Irene volunteered first. Ulrich looked at her. He nodded. They set out at dawn. They returned by evening, with 4 wolf pelts. Irene killed 2 of them herself, one with a sword, the second with a knife when he jumped on her back. Ulrich killed one. The guard Kell killed the 4th. The rest of the wolves fled into the mountains. Irene returned with a torn sleeve and a scratch on her neck. Lyra treated the wound. Irene sat on a bench in the workshop and watched silently as the herbalist applied the ointment. Lyra asked if it hurt. Irene replied that it didn't. Lyra said she was lying. Irene smiled. It was the first smile anyone had ever seen on her face. That evening, Aiden sat in his study, thinking about wolves. Not the ones with fangs, the ones with swords. Because if a pack of hungry wolves had come down from the mountains, people would soon follow. Bandits, deserters, looters. Winter drives not only beasts. He called for Ulrich. He said they needed more guards. 12 wasn't enough. They needed 30, 50 by spring. Ulrich asked where they would find the men. There were 300 people in the town, of whom at most 60 were men fit for battle. And half of them worked in the mine or the warehouse. Aiden replied that not all guards had to be fighters. They needed lookouts. They needed signalmen. They needed people to stand on the wall and keep watch. You didn't need a sword for that. You needed eyes and legs and the ability to blow a horn. Old men and teenagers were capable of that. And women. Ulrich grimaced. One woman in the guard is one thing. A whole squad is another. Aiden replied that in a month, Irene had turned 12 men into fighters. If she took on 10 more recruits of any gender or age, by spring, Holdgrave would have 22 trained guards and 10 lookouts. Ulrich thought about it. For a long time. Then he nodded, and went off to talk to Irene. Irene listened, silently. Then she asked just one thing. Would the recruits listen to her? Ulrich replied that he would make them. Irene shook her head, and said there was no need to make them. She'd handle it herself. And the next morning, there were not 12 people standing in the castle courtyard, but 22. Among them were 2 15-year-old teenagers, a 30-year-old widow who had come because she wanted to be able to protect her children, and old one-armed Finn, who said you could hold a shield with just one hand. Irene looked at them, at this motley crew, at the teenagers shivering from the cold, at the widow clutching a wooden sword like a rolling pin, at Finn with his one hand and his stubborn eyes. And for the first time in 6 years, she felt that she belonged. The 90th day of winter, the longest night of the year. Aiden hadn't slept. He was sitting in his study reading. Not lists, not reports. Letters. Old letters from his father. He'd found them a week ago, in the castle's basement, behind a false wall in the archives that he'd noticed by chance. The masonry was slightly newer than the rest of the wall. By 5 years, maybe 10. Someone had built the niche recently. Aidan asked Ulrich to dismantle the masonry. Behind the wall was a box, an oak box, with a lock. The key was found among his father's personal belongings. Small, bronze, on a chain that the old duke used to wear around his neck. Inside the box were letters, 12 letters, written in my father's hand, encrypted, not with a complex cipher, just a simple letter substitution. Aidan cracked it in 2 hours. Daniel Ho in Chicago once got hooked on cryptography for 3 months after his company lost data due to a hack. The hobby of a 30-year-old manager came in handy for a 19-year-old lord in a world without computers. The letters were addressed to himself, a diary, a secret one. His father had kept it during the last 2 years of his life. And what Aidan read turned everything upside down. His father knew about the ore, not lead or copper, something else. On the very lowest levels of the old mine, beyond the cave-in that had occurred 20 years ago, lay a vein of a completely different ore. His father called it star iron, silvery, heavy, unlike anything known. The old chronicles in the castle library mentioned this metal. The ancient empire that ruled Erden 200 years ago used it, not for weapons, for tools, precise scales, compasses, quills that never broke, clock mechanisms. Star iron was the foundation of a civilization that built roads and schools and established standards of weights and measures. That civilization had fallen, and no one remembered why. My father wanted to reach that vein. He wanted to understand what kind of metal it was. He wanted to tell his sons, but he didn't have time. In his last letter, 2 weeks before his death, Father wrote that he felt strange, weakness, dizziness, a bitter taste in his mouth every morning. He suspected poison, but he didn't know who was behind it. He wrote that we needed to be more careful, that someone knew about the mine, someone who didn't want the star iron to be found. The last line of the last letter. If I die, let the boys know. The future lies beneath the rock. Aidan sat in a chair, holding the letter. His hands didn't tremble. He wouldn't let them. But inside he felt cold. His father had been killed. Not illness, not old age. Poison. Someone had poisoned him, slowly, carefully, so that it would look like he was simply fading away, and that someone was still alive, and perhaps was still watching Holdgrave. He put the letters back in the drawer, locked it, hung the key around his neck. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet, anyway. Because there was someone in the castle who had access to his father's food. One of his own people. Or someone who'd been sent in. Aidan couldn't trust anyone. He couldn't take any chances. He needed a man. His own man. Someone who could see what others were hiding. Someone who knew how to move in the shadows. That man appeared 11 days later. On the 101st day, the last week of winter. Snow still lay on the ground, but the sun was already warm. Drips from the roofs, streams along the roads. The pass was beginning to open up. And it wasn't just merchants who had returned to the city. Aidan was working in his office at night, alone. Zion had gone to bed an hour ago. Garvin was on duty downstairs. Guards stood on the walls. It was quiet. Aidan was writing a plan for the spring. A long one. A detailed one. The development of the mine. The expansion of the road. A second inn. New orders for the artisans. Recruiting people from neighboring villages. He didn't hear the window open. He felt a draft. Cold. Sharp. He looked up. A figure stood by the window. Small. In dark clothing. A hood. The face in shadow. Her hands were empty, but Aidan saw her right hand move slightly toward her waist, where a knife was surely tucked. He didn't jump up. He didn't scream. He sat up straighter and asked what she wanted. She. He said she because the figure was too small and too light to be a man. The figure froze. For a second. 2. Then a voice. Young. Female. Slightly hoarse. She said she'd come for the documents. On the desk. The ones with the seal. Aidan looked at his desk. At the documents. At the Holdgreaves seal standing nearby. And calmly asked who had sent her. Silence. Then she said she wouldn't say. Aidan nodded. Stood up. Slowly. walked over to the desk, picked up the documents, held them out to her. She didn't move, just stood there, peering out from under her hood. He could only see her chin, sharp, young, and a tattoo on the wrist of her right hand, small, in ink, the symbol of the Thieves' Guild of the Southern Ports. Aidan recognized that symbol. The memory of the young Aidan Holdgrave contained fragments of knowledge about the world. The Thieves' Guild of Port Care, a serious organization, not street pickpockets, professionals. He put the documents back and said he had a better offer. She could take the documents and bring them back to whoever sent them, and in a week, that someone would send another thief. Or she could sit down at the table and listen to what he had to say. Silence, a long one. Then she pulled back her hood. 19 years old, blonde hair cut short, a sharp face, gray eyes, alert, like a cat that sees both a mouse and a dog at the same time. She said her name was Mira Turn, and that she was listening. Aidan pointed to a chair. She sat down. She didn't relax. Her back was straight. Her hands were in plain sight, ready to stand up and jump out the window at any second. Aidan sat down across from her and told her what he needed. Not a guard, not a fighter, not a merchant, a person who sees the world from the shadows, who knows how to listen without hearing, to look without seeing, to find what people hide. Intelligence, counterintelligence, the Secret Service. Every serious lord has one. He doesn't, and he needs someone to create it. Mira listened. Her expression was blank. Then she asked why her. He didn't know her. She'd come to rob him. In a minute, she could climb out the window and vanish. Why should he trust her?
Aidan replied calmly.
He said that if she'd wanted to steal, she would have done it quietly. She stood by the window for a second too long. Because she wanted to be noticed. Because the documents weren't the goal. The goal was him. She'd come to see the young lord everyone was talking about in the harbor taverns. Mira didn't move. But something in her eyes had changed. Just a little. Like a ripple on the water. Aidan continued. He said he knew about the Port Ka era. He knew the guild used people and then discarded them. He knew Mira had run away from there, because she hid the tattoo on her wrist, whereas those in the guild wore theirs with pride. Mira was silent, for a long time. Then she said quietly that he saw too much for a 19-year-old boy. Aidan replied that he often heard that. He laid out the terms. Work, pay, housing, access to his archives, complete trust. She would be his eyes and ears. In the city, on the roads, at the courts of neighboring barons. Everywhere she needed to see without being seen. In return, one rule. She wouldn't lie to him. Ever. If she betrayed him, he wouldn't even be surprised. But he chose to trust her. Right now. From day one. Mira sat there. She looked at him, gray eyes, unblinking. She had seen a lot in her life. Guildmasters who smiled and stabbed. Barons who promised and forgot. Merchants who paid and betrayed. No one had ever told her they believed her. No one had ever given her the keys to the archives. No one had ever offered her a seat at the table. She stood up, walked over to the window, stood there for a second, closed the window, turned to Aidan, and said she was staying. Spring arrived on the 110th day. The pass opened. The snow melted from the road. The Sarabrianca Creek swelled with meltwater, but the bridge held. The new bridge, the very one that 23 men had built in 5 days that fall. It held. The first caravan crossed it 2 days after the snow melted. 6 wagons. Marcus Dern. He returned as promised, with cloth and salt and oil and iron, and with news. There were 2 kinds of news, good and bad. The good news. Rumors about Holdgrave were spreading through the southern trading towns. An inn at the pass, fair prices, a new market, standard nails and horseshoes, an unusual young lord who pays artisans in advance. Merchants were talking about it in the taverns, with curiosity, with skepticism, but they were talking. The bad news. Baron Morven Court had heard these rumors too, and he didn't like them. Marcus told Aidan this over dinner. He spoke cautiously, choosing his words carefully. Baron Morven owned the lands east of Holdgrave, Wolf's Maw Pass. The road through his lands had been the main trade route to the north for the past 30 years. Merchants paid Morven a toll for passage, a hefty toll. But now the merchants had started taking the road through Holdgrave instead. Because it's shorter. Because the bridge is new. Because there's a place to spend the night at the pass. Every merchant who traveled through Holdgrave bypassed Morven's lands. Every merchant meant lost toll revenue. Morven was just as good at counting money as Zion, and he had already begun to tally his losses. Marcus said he'd overheard some talk. In Morven's taverns, people were saying that young Holdgrave had gotten too big for his britches, that the kid was straying from his own path, that it was time for someone to put him in his place. Aiden listened. He nodded. He ate his soup. And he thought. Morven's reaction was to be expected. Sooner or later, a neighbor was bound to notice. The question was what Morven would do. He wouldn't attack. Not right away. Morven was a smart man. 3 wars, 2 dead wives. He didn't rush headlong into battle. He applied pressure, slowly, methodically. Trade blockades, bribed highwaymen, false complaints to the Duke, rumors. That's exactly how smart predators apply pressure. Not with fangs, by suffocation. Aiden finished his lunch. He thanked Marcus. Then he went to see Mira. Mira lived in a small room above the stables. She'd chosen it herself. She said there were 2 ways out, one through the door, the other through the roof. Aiden found her there. She was sitting on the windowsill, sharpening a knife. A small one, a thin one. A knife like that isn't for fighting. It's for work. He told her about Morven. Mira listened. She nodded. She said she knew more about Morven than Marcus did, because over the past 2 weeks, she'd already managed to visit 3 taverns on the border of his lands, disguised as a traveling merchant. Aiden looked at her. She'd been working for 2 weeks. He hadn't given her a specific assignment yet. She'd started on her own. Mira continued. Morven had hired 8 men. Not soldiers. Forest folk. Vagabonds. People who couldn't be linked to the Baron. They were holed up in the village of Crooked Oak, a 2-day journey from the pass. Waiting. Mira didn't know exactly what for. But 8 armed men in a village inhabited by 20 old men. That's no coincidence. Aiden nodded. Bandits. Morven was sticking to the classics. Bribed bandits on the roads. A few raided caravans, and merchants would stop traveling through Holdgrave. The road would be deserted again. And everything would go back to the way it was. Simple and effective. Unless you knew in advance. Aiden knew in advance. Because he had Mira. He asked her if she could find out when these people would strike. Mira replied that she already knew. In 5 days. The first large caravan from the south would pass through the pass. 10 wagons, cloth, dye, and spices. A rich caravan, an easy target. The bandits would strike on the descent from the pass. The forest is close by there. The road is narrow. The perfect spot for an ambush. Aiden thought about it for a minute. 2. Then he turned to Mira and said he needed that caravan to get through. Unscathed. Unharmed. And that the bandits be captured. Not killed. Captured. Alive. Mira raised an eyebrow. She asked why alive. Dead ones are easier. Aiden replied that the dead don't talk. But he needed them to talk. In the square. In front of witnesses. And to name the person who hired them. Mira smiled. For the first time. Subtly. With just one corner of her mouth. And she said she understood. 3 days later, Aiden gathered Ulrich and Irene. He laid out the plan. Ulrich frowned. He said that an ambush within an ambush was a dangerous game. What if there were more than 8 bandits? What if they had crossbows? What if they knew the forest better than the guards? Aiden nodded. He turned to Irene. He asked for her opinion. Irene thought in silence. Then she said that 8 vagabonds weren't an army. If they knew the place and time of the ambush, they could prepare. She needed 10 people. Ulrich and the 5 best guards, herself and 3 of her recruits, plus Mira, for reconnaissance. Ulrich looked at Irene. A 24-year-old girl was dictating his strategy to him. 6 months ago, he would have shown her the door. Now he nodded. Because over the past 6 months, she had proven herself through more than just words. 2 days later, the squad set out for the pass. Quietly. At night. Without torches. Mira had left a day earlier. Reconnaissance. The caravan was on schedule. 10 wagons. 14 people. A merchant from Chiron named Solemn. He knew nothing about the ambush. He didn't know that bandits were following him. He didn't know that guards were following the bandits. The ambush took place at dawn on the 5th that day. A gorge on the descent from the pass. A forest 10 paces from the road. 8 men emerged from behind the trees, armed. Dirty, unshaven, professional. They blocked the road with a felled tree. Solemn screamed. The caravan guards grabbed their weapons. And then, from the forest on the other side, Holdgrave's guards. Holdgrave's men emerged from the forest on the other side. 10 men, in formation, with crossbows. Irene was in the lead, sword drawn, her face calm. The bandits froze. They looked back. They saw the crossbows. They counted. 8 against 10, plus the caravan guards. The oldest among them was the first to drop his weapon. The rest followed suit.
A minute later, all 8 were lying face down in the mud with their hands tied.
Irene hadn't spilled a single drop of blood, just as Aiden had asked. Solemn stood by his wagon, breathing heavily through his mouth. Then he approached Irene. He asked who she was. She replied that she was Lord Holdgrave's guard, patrolling the road to ensure the safety of the trade caravans. Solemn looked at her, then at the guards, then at the bound bandits, and quietly asked if the patrol passed by regularly. Irene replied that it did every week. Solemn nodded. He got into the wagon and drove on toward Holdgrave, where in the market square he would spend 3 times as much as he had planned, because the road through Holdgrave had just become the safest road in the north. The bandits had been brought into the city. Aiden had interrogated them personally. He hadn't tortured them. He didn't beat them. He put them in the cellar, on dry hay, with food and water, and he waited. 2 days later, the leader spoke up, because Mira had found his weak spot. The leader had a son, in the village of Crooked Oak, 8 years old. Mira didn't threaten the boy. She simply told the leader that if he spoke up, the boy would be brought to Holdgrave, to school, where he would be taught to read and count, and where he would grow up not as a bandit, but as a human being. The eldest remained silent all night. In the morning, he spoke. He named a name, Baron Morven Court. He paid through a middleman, 20 coins per person. The assignment was simple, to rob caravans on the road through Holdgrave. 2 weeks, then disappear. Aiden listened. He wrote it down, and he let all 8 of them go. He gave each of them 10 marks, and he said that if any of them wanted an honest job, the Holdgrave mine was hiring. 3 agreed. The rest left. The elder son arrived in Holdgrave a week later. It was the 4th month since the awakening. Spring was in full swing. The snow had melted even from the mountain peaks. The road through the pass was dry and firm. Caravans passed through every week, 3, 4, sometimes 5. Holdgrave's market square, which 4 months earlier had been occupied by 3 old women selling turnips, was now bustling. 12 stalls. Cloth, salt, oil, spices, leather, iron, and Holdgrave's products. Nails of a single length, horseshoes of a single size, lead sheets, copper ingots, pitchers of a single volume, crates with hinged lids, everything standardized, all identical. All the kind of things no one else made anymore. Merchants came out of curiosity. They left with orders. Because standard goods are goods you can count, that you can stack, that you can transport without loss. A merchant who buys 100 nails of the same length knows he'll get 100 nails, not 93 different pieces of iron. Bran worked with 3 apprentices, from dawn till dusk. His forge smoked so thickly that the wind changed color. He made 200 nails a week, 300 horseshoes a month, hinges, locks, staples, all the same size, all according to the template Aiden had drawn for him on a piece of leather. Bran no longer asked why they all had to be the same. He understood. He understood when the first merchant from the south ordered 1,000 nails from him and paid in advance. 1,000. Bran stood there with a sack of silver in his hands, unable to speak. Then he turned to his senior apprentice, a young man named Lane, and said 2 words that went down in Holdgrave's history: labor productivity. He uttered them as if reciting a prayer, slowly, respectfully, with a touch of reverent awe. Lane didn't understand, but he remembered. In the 5th month, Aiden conducted his first audit, a word that didn't exist here. He went through every single item: the mine, the road, the inn, the market, the treasury, the warehouse, the workshops. And he recorded everything. Zion walked beside him with a notebook, jotting down the figures he dictated. The mine yielded a metric ton of lead ore per week, 500 pounds of copper. 22 people were working there. Court commanded like a general. The adit was being deepened every week. The supports were new. The water had been drained. Not a single fatality. Not a single serious injury. Lyra came to the mine twice a week. She checked on the workers. She treated minor wounds. She made sure they were eating and drinking properly. Aiden had insisted on it. In his world, workplace safety was tedious bureaucracy. Here, it saved lives. The road was operational. Both bridges were standing. The third section was repaired during the first week of spring. Travel time from the southern lands to Holdgrave had been cut to 2 days. Through Morven's lands, it took 3.5, a difference of a day and a half. For a merchant with 10 wagons, a day and a half is food for the horses, payment for security, food for people. A day and a half is money. And the money spoke in Holdgrave's favor. The ink at the pass was full every night. Devon completed the second phase of construction. 6 more rooms, a bathhouse, a large hall with a hearth where merchants ate together at long tables. The cook hired 2 assistants. The stable was expanded. A new sign, bright, visible from afar. The Pass Inn. That's what they called it. And merchants from Chiron to Westmark already knew that name. The treasury. Zion laid out the figures on the table in front of Aiden. 5 months' revenue, 320 marks. Expenses, 280. Profit, 40 marks. Plus the balance from the initial treasury. Total, 212 marks in the treasury. A profit for the first time in 10 years. Zion looked up. She said quietly that she hadn't made a mistake. She'd checked 3 times. Aiden looked at the numbers, then at Zion, and said she deserved a day off. Zion didn't understand. She asked what a day off was. Aiden froze. Then he explained. A day when you don't work. Zion thought for a moment. Then she replied that she didn't want a day off. She wanted a new notebook. Her old one was almost full. Aiden laughed. For the first time in 5 months. A real laugh. Loud. Short. Zion looked at him in surprise. She'd never heard him laugh before, and she didn't understand what was so funny. But the corners of her lips twitched slightly. Just a little. Aiden gave her 2 new notebooks and a quill. A good one. A goose quill. From the first batch Marcus had brought back from the south. Zion took the quill. She twirled it between her fingers. Then she put it in her pocket. Carefully, as if it were a treasure. The next morning, Aiden found a fresh to-do list on his desk, written with the new quill, in Zion's small, neat handwriting. And next to the sheet of paper lay some warm bread, wrapped in a clean cloth. He looked at the bread, at the list, at the empty chair where Zion sat every evening, and he realized that she'd been doing this every morning, the list and the bread. Every morning, from the very first day she became treasurer. He just hadn't noticed. He noticed now. In the 6th month, Hannah arrived. Hannah So, 22 years old, dark eyes, a straight back, a face with features from the Far East. She had arrived with Marcus's last caravan, not as a merchant but as a passenger, with a single sack and her 12-year-old younger brother, who was clinging to her hand and wouldn't let go. She came to the castle gates and asked the Lord for an audience. The guard looked at her eastern face, her tattered clothes, and the boy, and said that the Lord did not receive vagrants. Iron was standing nearby. She heard him. She approached the guard and quietly said that Lord Holdgrave received everyone. The guard turned pale. He let her through. Hannah entered the office. She bowed, briefly, without fanfare, and said she wanted to sell something. She placed a bundle on the table. She unwrapped it. Inside were maps, trade maps, dozens of them. Routes, ports, prices, seasonal fluctuations, contacts for merchants in 6 cities, a journal of transactions spanning 10 years. All of this had belonged to her father, the merchant So, who had gone bankrupt 3 years ago. Not through stupidity, through injustice. His business partner had cheated him, forged documents, stolen the goods. Her father was left with debts and 2 children. He died a year later. Hannah was left alone, with her brother, with debts, and with these maps, the last thing she had left. She wanted to sell them and leave for the east, back to her father's relatives, if they were still alive. Aiden took the cards. He turned over the first one, looked at it, turned over the second. The third. He read them carefully, in silence. 20 minutes. Hannah stood there, waiting. Her brother sat on a chair in the corner, quiet, frightened. Aiden looked up and said he wouldn't buy the cards. Hannah pressed her lips together. She nodded. She reached out to take them back. Aiden raised his hand. He said he wouldn't buy the cards because they cost more than he could afford. But he could offer something better than money. A job. Hannah froze. Aiden continued. He needed someone who understood trade. Not just as a shopkeeper does, but as a system. Routes, flows, seasons, prices, connections. He needed someone who could see the entire map of trade routes and find the gaps through which money was leaking. Her father could do that. She was her father's daughter. He offered her the chance to lead the Holdgrave Trade Guild, a guild that would have to be built from the ground up. Hannah looked at him for a long time. Then she asked if he understood that she was a woman and a foreigner, and that in this world, a foreign woman at the head of a trade guild wasn't just a curiosity. It was an insult to every merchant who walked through its doors. Aiden replied that offended merchants buy exactly as much as those who aren't offended. And a trade guild, led by someone who can read trade, sells more than a guild without such a person. And that he doesn't care about the insults. He needs results. Hannah was silent. Then she tilted her head slightly and said that he was either a madman or a genius, and that she couldn't tell which one he was. But she wanted to find out. She stayed. Aiden sent his brother to school. Little Yoon-so sat on a bench next to Bran, the blacksmith's son, and Volt, the miller's son. 3 boys. 3 different worlds. 1 classroom. Hannah started working the next day. The first thing she did was spread out her father's maps on the wall of her office next to Aiden's map. His red dots and blue lines overlapped with her trade routes, and the picture they both saw was such that Hannah fell silent for a moment. Then she said quietly that Holdgrave stood at the point where 3 routes intersected: the northern route to Westmark, the southern route to Chiron, and the eastern route to Soldaru. And if they built a full-fledged trade hub here, with a guild, warehouses, and a standard currency, then in 2 years, every 3rd caravan on the continent would pass through this place. Aiden nodded, and replied that this was exactly why he'd hired her. Hannah looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. A sharp, quick smile, like someone who had finally found a partner worthy of the game. The 8th month. Summer was well past its midpoint. Holdgrave was growing. Not quickly, like a tree. 1 ring per season. The population had surpassed 500. People were coming from the surrounding villages, from neighboring baronies, even from the south. Rumors drew them in like the smell of bread draws in the hungry. In Holdgrave, they pay. In Holdgrave, they heal. In Holdgrave, they teach children to count. A strange young lord hires everyone, even the crippled, even women, even foreigners. Every new person is a mouth to feed, but also hands that work. Zion kept track. Every day, notebook after notebook, revenue grew faster than expenses. The mine produced copper and lead. Bran and his workshop nailed, shoed, and forged without stopping. The inn at the pass was open every night. Hannah opened a merchant's guild, a small one. 3 rooms on the market square, a sign, scales, a negotiating table. And Kana sat at that table, her back straight, and her dark eyes seeing every lie every merchant would tell 3 sentences before he even uttered it. The first merchants entered her office with a smirk. A woman, a foreigner, head of the guild. They left without a smirk, because Hannah knew the prices of fabric in Chiron better than the Chiron merchants themselves. She knew the seasonal fluctuations in grain prices more accurately than the grain exchanges of the South, and she could calculate margins in her head faster than most merchants could on paper. Within a month, her name was known in every trading post along the northern routes. Within 2 months, people were making special trips to see her, not to buy but to seek advice. Hannah So of Holdgrave became a name spoken with respect, sometimes with irritation, but always with respect. Aiden watched. He smiled inwardly and made his next moves. Coin standardization, that was his next move. Erden's silver mark was a mess. Every baron minted his own. The weight varied, the fineness varied. A merchant buying at the market in one city and selling in another lost up to 15% simply due to the difference in coins. Aiden proposed an idea to Hannah. The Holdgrave mark. Their own, with a fixed weight, with a guaranteed silver fineness, with the raven coat of arms on the obverse and a number on the reverse. A number, not a pattern, a number that indicates the value. Hannah looked at him for a long time. Then she said that this would change everything. Aiden replied that that was exactly why he was doing it. Bran cast the first mold, a copper one, precise. Zion weighed the first coin on Lyra's apothecary scales. Exactly, down to the last speck of dust. 10 grams of silver, pure,
without impurities.
The first batch of 100 coins was ready a week later. Aiden gave them to Marcus. He said that from now on, all settlements with Holdgrave would be in these coins. Marcus twirled the coin between his fingers. He tested it with his teeth. He looked at the denomination, at the coat of arms, at the smooth edge without burrs, and he whistled softly. Within 2 months, the Holdgrave coin was accepted in 4 cities, not because Aiden forced them to, but because it was better, more honest, more reliable. A merchant who paid with a Holdgrave mark knew he would receive exactly what was written on it. No more, no less. Trust is a currency more valuable than silver. In the 9th month, Evelyn arrived. Evelyn Cassian, 20 years old, the youngest daughter of Count Cassian. The very same Cassian whose lands lay south of Holdgrave. The Cassian who, together with Morwen, had been eyeing Aiden's lands. She arrived in a carriage, with 2 maids, with a trunk of clothes, with a lute in its case, and with a letter from her father. The letter was polite. Count Cassian expressed his deepest respect for the young Lord Holdgrave and offered a gesture of goodwill. His daughter would be a guest at the Holdgrave court, as a sign of friendship and a possible future alliance. Aiden read the letter. He looked at Evelyn. She was standing in the hall, pale, graceful. Her dark hair was pulled up high. Her dress was expensive. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her face was like a mask, a beautiful, cold mask behind which nothing could be seen. Aiden saw it. He saw how her right pinky finger trembled slightly, how her eyes darted too quickly around the room, memorizing the layout of the doors and windows, how she stands slightly sideways to him, like someone accustomed to protecting her vulnerable side. A spy. Cassian sent his daughter as a spy, a clever move. A daughter at court is not a threat but an honor. To refuse would be an insult. To accept would be to let strangers' eyes and ears into his home. Aiden accepted. He told Evelyn that he was pleased to welcome her to Holdgrave, that she would be given the finest room in the castle, that she could roam freely throughout the town and the castle, everywhere, without restrictions. Evelyn blinked. Everywhere, without restrictions. That's not what you say to a spy. That's what you say to a guest.
Or it's a trap.
She thanked him. Coldly. Politely. She went to her room. That evening, Aiden called Mira. He explained the situation. Mira nodded. She said she would keep an eye on things. Aiden shook his head. He said it wasn't necessary. Let Evelyn watch. Let her see. Let her count the people, the supplies, and the guards. Let her overhear the conversations. Let her write to her father. Everything she sees will only confirm one thing. Holdgrave is stronger than Cassian thinks, and attacking him is a bad idea. Mira raised an eyebrow. She asked what if the girl found something that would really do harm? A weak spot, a secret. What then? Aiden replied that Holdgrave's only real secret lay in a sealed box under his bed. Letters from his father. Star. Everything else can be revealed. Because Holdgrave's power doesn't lie in secrets, it lies in the system. And the system can't be stolen. It can only be replicated. And to replicate it, you have to understand it. And to understand it, you have to think like Aiden. And no one on this continent can do that. Mira looked at him, silently. Then she said that he was either the smartest person she'd ever met or the most arrogant. Aiden replied that usually, they're one and the same. Evelyn spent a week at the castle. She walked around the city, in silence. She observed the market, the blacksmith shop, the mine, the school, Lyra's workshop, the training yard where Irene put the guards through their paces, Hannah's merchant's guild, the warehouses, the inn. She saw everything. And the more she saw, the quieter she became. Because what she saw didn't fit the picture her father had painted for her. Her father had said that Holdgrave was a dying backwater, led by a mad young man, that all she had to do was wait, and it would fall apart on its own. But she saw a city that was alive, that was growing, where children went to school, and the blacksmith spoke words she didn't understand. Labor productivity. What does that even mean? On the 10th day, Evelyn was sitting in the great hall, playing the lute. Alone. Evening. Candles. A quiet melody. Aiden walked in. He heard the music. He stopped at the door. He listened. The melody was beautiful, sad, as if someone were singing about a place they'd lost and couldn't find their way back to. Evelyn noticed him. She stopped playing. She stood up. She curtsied. Aiden said she didn't need to stand. He sat down across from her, in silence. Then he asked what the melody was. Evelyn replied that it was an old song, from her childhood. Her mother used to sing it to her when she was little. Her mother died when Evelyn was 12. Silence. Then Aiden asked, quietly, simply, what did she herself want? Not her father, not her family, just her. Evelyn froze. Her fingers froze on the lute's neck. She looked at him and couldn't find an answer, because no one had ever asked her that question. She stood up, picked up the lute, went to her room. She didn't come out for 3 days. On the 4th day, she came out, with red eyes. And for the first time ever, she smiled at Zion, just a little, with her lips alone, but it was a start. The first year was drawing to a close, the 12th month. Holdgrave was standing on his own 2 feet, without staggering, not limping. He stood. The mine yielded ore every week. Copper was flowing. Cord had been right. The left vein was copper, rich, abundant. Bran was forging. Devon was building. The market was buzzing. Hannah was trading. Zion was counting. Lyra was healing. Irene was training. Mira was listening. Evelyn watched. The system worked. Like clockwork. Like a machine. Like a living organism in which every organ knew its role. Aiden sat in his office and looked at the map. That very same map with red dots and blue lines that he had drawn on the first night. Half the dots had turned green. It's working. It's alive. It's generating income. The other half is still red. 3 villages in the northeast. The old bridge over the Kamnahode River. The second mine that Court considered promising. The road west to the coast. All of that is for next year. A knock at the door. Garvin. The old seneschal entered. He stood by the table. Silently, Aiden looked up. He looked at him. Garvin was different. Not the same gray-haired old man who had stood over him in the chapel a year ago with the face of an undertaker. His back was straighter. His eyes were livelier. He had lost weight. Not from hunger. From movement. From work. From the fact that for the first time in 10 years, he had a reason to get up in the morning. Garvin walked silently to the table. He placed his staff in front of Aiden. Wooden. Old. Worn smooth by the thousands of hands of 3 generations of seneschals. An ancient symbol of loyalty. Aiden looked at the staff, then at Garvin. Garvin began to speak, slowly, with difficulty, like a man who had been gathering his words for a year and had finally resolved to speak them. He said he had served Aiden's grandfather for 20 years. He had served his father 15 years. He thought he'd outlive his grandson, too. He thought Holdgrave would die, that the line would end, that the last stone of the castle would crumble in his lifetime and he'd have to witness it. He was wrong. And he asks for forgiveness for the old man who had his doubts, who whispered behind people's backs, who had nearly walked away 3 times this year. He wants to serve, truly, not out of duty, not out of habit, because for the first time in 30 years, he believes he is serving a man who is worthy of that service. Aiden stood up. He took the staff. He looked at it and handed it back with both hands, as one hands back something precious. Then he embraced the old man, tightly, as he would have embraced a father he'd never known. Garvin stood there, his hands at his sides. Then he slowly raised one hand, placed it on Aiden's shoulder, and stood there, in silence. Life went on as usual in the square below the window. Children ran toward the well. Bran hammered away. A cart creaked at the warehouse gate. No one saw this scene. But from that day on, something had changed. Not in the city, in the castle. Garvin no longer argued. He no longer whispered. He no longer doubted. He obeyed. Quickly, precisely, with a fire in his eyes he hadn't had in 20 years, and when one of the newcomers referred to Aiden as young master, Garvin corrected them. Quietly, firmly, our master. A week after that, Morven. Not by bandits, not by rumors. For real, 50 horsemen crossed the Holdgrave border at dawn. They weren't heading for the town, they were heading for the mine. 22 miners, 1 old court. No guards. Mira found out within a day. Her contact in the village on the border of Morven's lands had spotted the detachment and sent a signal. A pigeon. The first pigeon of Holdgrave's secret service. Mira received the message at dawn. She ran to Aiden. Aiden didn't panic. He unfolded the map. He looked at the distances. He calculated the time. Morven's detachment would reach the mine in 8 hours. Irene could gather 30 guards in an hour. It was a 3-hour walk to the mine, 2 hours on horseback. There were few horses in Holdgrave, 12. That meant 12 on horseback and 20 on foot. The foot soldiers wouldn't make it in time. Riding alone against 50 would be suicide. Ulrich suggested fortifying their position in the town and waiting. Let them take the mine. They could retake it later. Aiden shook his head. 22 people were in the mine. Living people. Court. Miners. If Morven takes the mine, he won't take any prisoners. He'll kill them or take them away, and he'll say he knows nothing. The bandits are to blame, as always, Aiden thought. For a minute, 2. Then he turned to Irene and asked if she could, with 12 horsemen, hold off 50 horsemen. Not defeat them, just hold them off. For 2 hours, Irene thought. Then she nodded. If they chose the right spot, a narrow one, where 50 horsemen couldn't turn around. The road to the mine runs through the Stone Throat Gorge. Narrow, cliffs on both sides. There, 10 fighters could hold off 100. Aiden nodded. He turned to Ulrich. He ordered all the foot soldiers to be rounded up and led to the mine through the forest. Not along the road, through the forest, quickly. Ulrich opened his mouth to say that going through the forest would take longer. Then he looked at the map and shut his mouth. Going through the forest was the shorter route. The foot soldiers would arrive through the woods in 3 hours. If Irene could hold Morven up for 2 hours in the gorge, the foot soldiers would come up behind him. 50 horsemen in a narrow gorge, with 12 horsemen in front and 20 foot soldiers behind. That's a trap. Not a battle. A trap. Irene left 10 minutes later. 12 horsemen. The best ones. The ones she'd trained for half a year. Ulrich led the foot soldiers through the forest. 20 men. With pikes. With crossbows. It was hard. Fast. Through bushes and roots and streams. Aiden stayed in the city. By the window. Watching the detachments leave. Zion stood beside him. Silent. A notebook pressed to her chest. Lyra was preparing the workshop to receive the wounded. Hannah was closing the guild and leading the merchants to the castle. Evelyn stood on the wall and looked east. Her face was pale. Her hands were clenched. She knew that 50 horsemen meant it wasn't just Morven. It was Morven and her father, Cassian. Together, she recognized the banner of the second detachment, black with a silver stripe, the banner of her house. Her father had sent his men to kill those with whom she had lived for the past 2 months, those who had fed her, given her a room, and not locked the door. Evelyn stood on the wall, and something inside her was breaking, quietly, like ice cracking beneath her feet. Irene met Morwen's detachment in Stone Throat Gorge at noon. 12 mounted guards blocked the road. Irene was at the front, a sword in her hand, her red hair blowing in the wind, her voice steady. She shouted that these were Lord Holdgrave's lands and that the armed detachment had crossed the border without permission. She suggested they turn back. Morven's detachment commander looked at the 12 guards, at the woman with the sword, and laughed. 50 against 12. It wasn't even funny. He ordered the attack. Irene didn't back down. She reorganized her formation. The narrow gorge allowed only 4 to stand in a row. 50 horsemen squeezed into a line. They jostled each other. They got in each other's way. Their numerical superiority had become a liability, and Irene held the gorge for an hour and 40 minutes. She lost 2 guards to injury, not a single one killed. The attackers lost 5. Because Irene didn't fight like a knight. She fought like a soldier, without honor, without rules, effectively. When Commander Morvena finally began leading part of the cavalry around the rocks, his rearguard heard a sound. A horn. From behind. 20 of Ulrich's foot guards emerged from the forest and blocked the exit from the gorge. With crossbows. With pikes. In formation. Commander Morven looked back. Irene in front. Ulrich behind. Cliffs on either side. 50 horsemen trapped in a stone bag. He halted the attack, raised his hand, and proposed negotiations. Iron replied that Lord Holdgrave was in charge of negotiations. Not her. Her job was to hold the pass, and she was holding it. The commander was silent. Then he ordered a retreat. 50 horsemen turned around, slowly, with difficulty, and rode back, eastward, back to their baron, with 5 wounded, in disgrace. Realizing that the young man in Holdgrave was not the boy they had thought him to be. The second year. Holdgrave was no longer just a province. Holdgrave was now a name spoken at the courts of the 3 kingdoms, with surprise, with irritation, with reluctant respect. In the year following the Battle of Stonethroat, Aidan did what he had planned on that first night by candlelight. 3 villages in the northeast came back to life. People returned. The fields were plowed. A 3-field crop rotation. Wheat in the first field, rye in the second. The third lies fallow. A simple system that had been unknown here. The peasants used to sow a single field until the soil was exhausted. Then they'd abandon it and move on. Aidan explained. He demonstrated. He drew a diagram on the ground with a stick. The village elders listened with the expressions of people being told that the earth is round. They didn't believe it. But they did it. Because the Lord said so. The first harvest under the new system was a third larger than usual. The village elders came to Aidan, silently. They stood there, fiddling with their hats. Then the eldest said they wanted the Lord to draw something else for them with a stick on the ground. Anything. They'd do it. A second mine was opened, a copper mine, a rich one. Court commanded both. 40 miners. 2 tunnel entrances, drainage, support, ventilation. Court had learned that last word from Aidan and pronounced it with the same reverent dread with which Brand spoke of labor productivity. Ventilation. Fresh air into the mine through inclined tunnels from the surface. A simple idea. No one here had thought of it. The miners stopped coughing up blood after 3 months. Court said that in 40 years in the mines, he had buried more people from bad air than from cave-ins. The workshop school opened in the spring of the second year. Not just a school, a place where they taught a trade, arithmetic, reading, and law. Evelyn taught the latter. She knew the laws of Eärden better than any lawyer. 3 languages, charters, treaties, codes. Everything her father had instilled in her as a tool of politics now worked for Holdgrave. She taught children, teenagers, and adult men who sat at desks next to 12-year-olds and blushed with shame, but studied nonetheless. Because a literate craftsman is worth twice as much as an illiterate one. Aidan proved it. With numbers, on the blackboard, at school, in front of everyone. Evelyn wrote her father a letter. 1. A short one. In it, she told him she wouldn't be coming back. That her place was here. That she had found what she'd been searching for her whole life. Even though she didn't know what she was looking for. Count Cassian received the letter. He read it, crumpled it up, threw it into the fire, and didn't leave his chambers for 3 days. His youngest daughter. His tool. His weapon. She had chosen the enemy's side, not under duress, of her own free will. He could not forgive that, and he could not understand it. Holdgrave's army was growing. Iron commanded 200 trained fighters, not militiamen, soldiers, pikemen, crossbowmen, light cavalry, each trained according to the system Iron had built up over 2 years. Discipline, formation, rotation, supply, the last was key. Aidan had built a supply system for the army that was unlike anything else in Eärden. Warehouses for food, weapons, and equipment at every key location. Every soldier knew where the nearest supply depot was. Every commander knew how many days his unit could operate independently. Holdgrave's army wasn't the largest. It was the best supplied. Baron Morwen didn't rest after the defeat at Stonethroat. He joined forces with Cassian. He sent complaints to the Duke. He wrote to the capital, Westmark. He accused Aidan of rebellion, of usurpation, and of violating the rights of the senior house. Aidan's brother Lorcan supported the complaint. Lorcan in the south was furious. Quietly. Deeply. The younger brother to whom he had given barren land had suddenly become richer and more influential than he was. It was unbearable. Lorcan demanded that the younger line be returned to the senior line's guardianship according to ancient law. Aidan received Lorcan's letter. He read it. He set it on the table. He looked at Hannah. Hanna looked at him. Aidan asked how many merchants from Lorcan's lands were currently trading at the Holdgrave market. Hanna answered without looking at her notes. 17. Regulars. Aidan nodded. He wrote a reply to Lorcan. Polite. Brief. He was rejecting the demand, out of respect for the senior line. But Holdgrave would remain independent. Lorcan received the reply, and realized that taking Holdgrave peacefully would not be possible. Spring of the third year. Morwen and Cassian assembled a combined army, 400 men, cavalry and infantry,
The banners of the two houses. They marched on Holdgrave, not in secret,
openly, with drums and trumpets. Mira found out a week in advance. Her network of informants covered all the neighboring baronies, pigeon mail, signal fires on the 3 towers that Aidan had built at key points. The information traveled faster than the army, 5 days faster. Aidan convened a council. Everyone was there. Garvin, Orlick, Iron, Zion, Lyra, Hanna, Mira, Evelyn. 8 people around the table. A map in the center, figures. Red for the enemy, blue for their own. Aidan arranged the figures. 400 red on the eastern road, 200 blue in Holdgrave, 2-1. The odds were bad. Orlick said the city walls would hold. We could defend ourselves. Aidan shook his head. He said that defending ourselves meant letting them destroy everything outside the walls. The mine, the inn, the villages, the bridges, the roads, everything they'd been building for 2 years. Not an option. Iron asked what the Lord suggested. Aidan placed his finger on the map, on a spot 30 kilometers east of the city, the Valley of the 3 Streams. Wide, open, with 3 streams dividing it into 4 sectors.
a bad place for cavalry.
Mud, water, marshy banks. A good place for infantry with pikes. But it's not about tactics, Aidan said. It's about logistics. Morven and Cassian's 400 men are traveling by road. A 3-day journey. That means 3 days' worth of food. Fodder for the horses. Water. He asked Mira if they had a supply train. Mira replied that the supply train was small, 20 wagons. They were planning a swift strike, arrive, attack, and leave. A supply train for 3 days. No more. Aidan nodded and explained the plan. Don't attack Morven's army head-on. Don't defend the walls. Strike the supply train, cut off their supplies, and wait. An army without food becomes a mob in 2 days. Iren will lead 200 infantrymen to the Valley of the 3 Streams. He'll take up a defensive position. He won't attack. She'll hold her position. Ulrich, with 30 cavalrymen, will flank the army through the forest and strike the supply train in the rear. 20 wagons, with no serious escort. Ulrich will take them in an hour. Morven will be faced with a choice. Attack Iren's fortified position with no food in the rear, or retreat. Morven is smart. Morven will retreat.
The council was silent.
Then Hanna quietly said that this wasn't a tactic, it was logistics used as a weapon. Aidan replied that it was the only weapon he had. The battle in the Valley of the 3 Streams lasted 6 hours. Or rather, it wasn't a battle, it was a standoff. Iren held her position on the west bank of the stream. 200 pikemen in 3 lines, crossbowmen on the flanks, mud up to their knees. Morven stood on the east bank, 400 cavalrymen and infantrymen. He watched, he counted, he waited, he didn't attack. Because the cavalry would be as useless. Because the pikemen in formation on that bank are a wall. Because Morven was smart. 4 hours later, a messenger rode up. His face was ashen. The supply train had been captured. Orlick had seized all 20 wagons, without any losses. The supply train's escort surrendered when they saw 30 horsemen with crossbows. Morven listened to the messenger. He closed his eyes. He stood there like that for a minute. Then he ordered a retreat. 400 men turned around and headed east. Hungry, angry. Defeated not by the sword but by bread, or rather, by the lack of it. Aidan did not pursue them. He did not execute the prisoners. He released the convoy's guards. He gave each man a loaf of bread for the road, and he sent a message to Morven through them. Lord Holdgrave invites Baron Morven to dinner, unarmed, without an entourage, to talk. Morven arrived 2 weeks later, alone, without an entourage, just as requested, on an old war horse, wearing a traveling cloak without coats of arms, unarmed. The guards let him through without searching him, on Aiden's orders. Morwen rode through the streets of Holdgrave and looked around, in silence. He saw the city he'd been told about for 2 years, but stories are just words. But a city is stone and wood and people. A cobblestone square, new warehouses, signs on the doors of workshops, children walking home from school with slate boards under their arms, guards standing in formation at the gates, not ragged men with pikes, soldiers. Brand's smithy, from which smoke rose and the pounding sounded like the heartbeat of a living beast. The market square with 30 stalls. 30, in a market that had been empty just 2 years ago. Morwen dismounted in the castle courtyard. Irene met him. Silently. She led him to the staircase. Morwen looked at her sword, at the scar on her shoulder, the one she'd received in the Stone Throat Gorge at the hands of his men. He said nothing. He went upstairs. Aiden's study. Simple. A desk, a map on the wall, Zion's notebooks on the shelf, candles, 2 chairs. Aiden was sitting at the desk. He stood up when Morwen entered. They looked at each other, face to face for the first time. Morwen was a large man, 45 years old, graying temples, the hands of a soldier, the face of a man who had seen death often enough to stop fearing it and who was wise enough to begin respecting it. Aiden gestured to a chair. Morwen sat down. Aiden sat across from him. On the table stood a bottle of wine and 2 goblets. Aiden poured for both of them. Morwen took a goblet. He swirled it. He didn't drink. He looked at Aiden and said that the last time he'd had dinner with an enemy, poison had been mixed into the wine. Aiden took his goblet. He drank first, to the dregs. He set it down. He looked at Morwen. Morwen was silent for a moment. Then he smiled and drank. They talked for 4 hours. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten each other. They talked. Morwen told his side of the story. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who, for 30 years, had built his realm according to the rules he knew: the right of the senior lineage, the power of the sword, the subjugation of the weak to the strong. That was the order of things. Cruel, unjust, but an order nonetheless. And when Aiden began to break those rules, Morwen didn't see a reformer. He saw a threat. Because if a boy from the north could build a city from nothing and defeat an army with bread instead of a sword, then what would stop every peasant and blacksmith from deciding that the old order is no longer needed? That lords are unnecessary. That swords are unnecessary. That everything Morwen had built over 30 years no longer matters. Aiden listened. He nodded. He didn't interrupt. When Morwen finished, Aiden spoke. Quietly, calmly, without fanfare. He said that Morwen was right. The old order is crumbling, and he, Aiden, is bringing it down. Not with a sword, not with a rebellion, with a school, with roads, with coins. Because the old order is built on ignorance and fear, and ignorance and fear are a foundation that crumbles when people begin to count, read, and think. But he isn't bringing down the lords. He's bringing down the system in which a lord is needed simply because he has a sword and the right of birth. He is building a system in which a lord is needed because he builds roads and schools and mines, in which a lord is useful, in which people follow the lord not because they are afraid, but because they are better off with him. And Morwen may be part of this system, or not, but the system will exist, with him or without him. Morwen was silent, for a long time. But it was over. The candles were burning out. Outside the window, it was night, quiet, starry. Morwen stood up. He walked over to the window. He looked out at the city, at the lights in the windows, at the guards on the walls, at the smoke rising from Brand's smithy, which was still working even at night. Then he turned around. Slowly, he slipped the family ring off his finger. Heavy, golden, with a black stone. The ring worn by 7 generations of the barons of court. He placed it on the table in front of Aiden and said quietly, "He doesn't understand what Aiden is building. He's not sure if it's right. He's not sure if it won't destroy the world, but he no longer wants to stand in the way." Aiden took the ring. He looked at it. Then he handed it back. He said that Morwen's ring belonged to Morwen. He doesn't take other people's rings. He takes allies. Morwen stood there with the ring in his hand. Then he put it back on. He nodded and left. At dawn, alone, on an old horse. A month later, Morwen opened his road to Holdgrave merchants, duty-free. 2 months later, his eldest son arrived to study at Holdgrave's guild school. 3 months later, Morwen adopted the Holdgrave coin as the official currency of his lands. Cassian was left alone, without an ally, without an army large enough to pose a threat, without a daughter. He sat in his castle and drank, and with each passing month, his lands grew emptier. Because people were leaving, northward, to Holdgrave, where they were paid, where they were healed, where they were taught, where the blacksmith spoke words that sounded like a prayer. The 4th year, the 5th, the dry wind horde breached Erden's eastern borders. The steppe warriors advanced like a wall, 10,000 horsemen, led by a Khan who, for the first time in a century, had united the nomadic tribes. The old kingdoms are in a panic. Westmark is without a king. Chiron is in the midst of a civil war. Soldara has shut itself behind its walls. No one is prepared, except Holdgrave. Roads, warehouses, signal towers, an army of 3,000 trained soldiers, pigeon mail, Mira's intelligence, Kana's trade network, Zion's treasury, Lyra's medicine, Iron's sword, Evelyn's laws, and Aiden, who for 5 years had quietly built what looked like a province, but was, in fact, the only functioning system on the continent. The 10th year, the throne room of Westmark, ancient, stone, with columns that remembered the first kings. Stained glass windows cast colorful shadows on the floor. 3 thrones stood on a dais. 3, one for each kingdom. Empty. Empty for 3 years now, ever since the last king of Westmark died without an heir, and the other 2 kingdoms became mired in wars they could not end. Now the hall was full. 3 crowns, 5 ducal chains, 12 baronial rings, envoys from Soldara and Chiron, representatives from the 17 cities of the Northern League, merchants, lawyers, chroniclers, and behind each of them stood a story that had brought them here, to this hall, on this day. Because 10 years ago, a 19-year-old boy woke up on the stone floor of a chapel, wearing an ill-fitting black doublet, and asked for a map. The dry wind horde was defeated. Not in a single battle, in a campaign that lasted 2 years. Not with swords, with roads. Aiden did not lead the army. He led the supply lines. His roads delivered bread, arrows, and medicine to the front lines in 3 days. The roads of the old kingdoms took 10. His intelligence knew where the horde would strike a week before the attack. His signal towers relayed messages from the border to the capital in 4 hours. His field hospitals treated the wounded rather than burying them. His crossbowmen, trained by Iron, fired twice as often as the horde's archers because each had a standard supply of bolts from standard crates in standard warehouses. The armies of the 3 kingdoms fought. The Holdgrave system fed them, and when the Khan of the horde stood at the gates of Westmark and his 10,000 horsemen could not advance a single step because every village behind them was empty, every warehouse burned, every road cut off, and their own supply trains intercepted by Holdgrave's light cavalry, the Khan realized he had not lost a battle. He had lost the war that began 5 years ago when someone built the first inn at the pass and the first warehouse at the eastern gate of a small northern town. After the horde, the old kingdoms lay in ruins. Not physical ruins, political ones. There were no kings. Armies were shattered, treasuries were empty, roads were destroyed, cities were starving. And only one part of the continent remained standing, the Northern League, 17 cities and lands that had voluntarily adopted Holdgrave's laws and currency. Where schools were open, where hospitals stood, where the roads were intact, where people did not go hungry, where a blacksmith made standard nails, a healer treated patients for free, and children knew how to read and count. One by one, the cities and lands of the old kingdoms joined the League, not by force, by choice. Because joining meant getting roads, schools, currency, law, order. Not the old order based on swords and fear, a new one, based on bread and literacy. Now they stood in this hall, all of them. Aiden entered last, without armor, without a crown, without a sword, in a simple dark doublet. His boots were dusty, because he'd been riding for 3 days, because he didn't like carriages. 6 people walked beside him, Zion, with a notebook, as always. The 10th notebook in 10 years, 27 years, the chief treasurer of the Northern League. The woman whose signature appeared on every contract, every promissory note, and every coin. She walked quietly, back straight, eyes cast down at her notebook, counting her steps to the throne. Lyra, With a bag of herbs slung over her shoulder, 31 years old, chief healer of the League. Her network of hospitals covered the entire north. 200 healers she had trained personally. The book of herbs she had finally written, in her own hand, because Aiden had taught her to write, just as he'd promised. Erden's first medical book, Iren, with a sword, as always. 34 years old, commander of the League's army. 3,000 soldiers. The one who stood in Stone Throat Gorge with 12 guards against 50. The one who trained every fighter personally. The one who caught an arrow with her shoulder in the 4th year when someone tried to kill Aiden in the market square. Without fanfare, just doing their jobs. Hana, with a trade scroll, 32 years old, head of the League's Chamber of Commerce. A woman whose name was known in every port and every trading courtyard in Erden, who started with her father's maps and an empty room, and built a trade network that fed 17 cities. Evelyn, with a lute and a folder of documents. 30 years old, the League's chief legal officer, the one who wrote the Erden Code, the body of laws upon which the League was founded, the rights of artisans, the rights of merchants, the rights of women, the rights of children, laws that existed nowhere else in the world. The enemy's daughter who became the architect of a new order, of peace. Somewhere in the hall, invisible, as always, 29 years old, the head of the Secret Service, a network of informants in every city on the continent. The one who slept outside Aiden's office door all those nights when he thought the guard was on duty. He found out about it in the 5th year, by accident. He went out at night to get some water and saw her, on the floor by the door, curled up, with a knife under her pillow. He stood there and watched, and said nothing. In the morning, a blanket lay on her pillow, one that hadn't been there before. They never spoke of it. Aiden climbed the steps to the thrones. 3 thrones. He stopped. He looked at them, at the stone, at the carvings, at the empty seats where kings had once sat. Then he turned toward the hall. The hall was silent. 300 people, kings without crowns, dukes without armies, barons without money. They were all looking at a man who had neither ancient blood nor magical gifts, nor the right of primogeniture. A man who had roads and schools and workshops and a coin accepted everywhere, and people who loved him. The ambassador of the Westmark Council stepped forward. He knelt and recited the formula they had been preparing for 3 months. The Council of the Kingdom asks Lord Holdgrave to take upon himself the burden of the imperial crown of Erden, to unite the 3 kingdoms, to defend the lands, to bring order. The hall fell silent. Aiden looked at the envoy, then at the hall, at the faces. The envoys from Chiron, the soldiers, the dukes, the barons. Morwen stood by a column, gray-haired, 60 years old, a ring on his finger. That very one. He nodded to Aiden, barely noticeably. Cassian stood by the wall, aged, haggard. Next to him was Evelyn, his daughter, the one who hadn't returned, the one standing next to him now, in the hall. And he didn't leave her side, because she was the only thing he had left. And she stood next to him, because she had forgiven him, because Aiden had taught her that forgiveness isn't a weakness. It's the foundation. Lorcan hadn't come. Aiden's older brother had stayed in the south, on his own lands, which were growing emptier with each passing year. He didn't accept the invitation. He didn't accept the League. He didn't accept the coin. He didn't accept his brother. But his merchants traded in Holdgrave. His children attended Holdgrave's school. His soldiers ate bread from Holdgrave's warehouses during the war with the Horde. He didn't accept. But he accepted everything Aiden had built, silently, without a word, without a ring on the table. Someday he would come, or maybe not. Aiden didn't rush him. Aiden stood by the thrones and remained silent, for a long time. The hall waited. Then he spoke, quietly, so quietly that the back rows leaned forward to hear. He said he accepted, not as an emperor, as a man who has roads and bread and schools. He will not sit on the throne. The throne is stone. He will stand at the table, because work is done at the table. He will not take the crown. The crown is metal. He will take responsibility for every road, for every school, for every mine, for every child learning to count, for every blacksmith making nails of the same length, for every herbalist whose name is finally written on the door. He invites them, not to obey, to learn, to build, to walk alongside him. The doors are open. The hall was silent. For a second, 2, 3. Then Morven, standing by the column, began to clap, slowly, heavily, like a man clapping for the first time in 30 years. Another followed him, a third, a fifth, a 10th. The hall began to rumble, not with a roar, with a rumble, heavy, deep, like a stone that had shifted from its place. Aiden stood and watched, at the faces, at the hands, at the people who had come here from different corners of the continent. Because 10 years ago, he had placed 100 marks on a stone in front of 28 artisans and said he was paying in advance for work that didn't yet exist. He lowered his eyes. For a second, and he saw before him not a hall, a road, a highway at night, headlights, tired eyes in the rearview mirror, his daughter waiting, a cake with 5 candles. He didn't make it, but maybe he did. Here, where the old dupe had called him, the father he had never known. A prayer, a plea, directed through the void to those who know how to build. Aiden raised his head. He looked at the stained glass windows, a raven on a black field, the Holdgrave family crest, his crest. Then he looked at Zion, who was standing at the foot of the steps, counting something in her notebook, in a whisper, as always. And next to the notebook in her hand was a bundle, wrapped in a clean cloth, warm bread. She had brought him bread. Here, to the throne room of Westmark, because it was morning, and because every morning Sion Holdgrave placed a to-do list and warm bread on his desk. Every morning, for 10 years, without a single miss. Aiden walked down the steps. He took the bread. He broke it in half. He gave half to Zion. He ate the other half himself, in front of 300 people, ambassadors and kings and dukes and barons. Warm bread, from the hands of a girl who once considered herself a burden. In the back rows of the hall stood an old man, huge hands, a graying beard, red eyes from 40 years of smoke. Bran, the old blacksmith, who 10 years ago had asked why the master wanted nails of the same length. He stood there and looked at Aiden, at the bread, at Zion, at the hall full of people who had come here along roads that began with a single bridge over the Sarabrianca Creek. And he wiped his eyes with his sleeve and muttered to himself so quietly that only his apprentice Lane, standing next to him, could hear. "I told you so back then, guys," he said. "I told you that nails of the same length are simple."